Welcome back to Nightfall History, traveler. Tonight, we return to the cradle of civilization, to listen for the last heartbeat of Akkad, and the quiet echo of humanity's first empire. Between the slow-breathing rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, the land once shimmered beneath the eternal sun, a mosaic of marshes, floodplains, and wandering canals. It was here, in the heart of southern Mesopotamia, that humankind took its first measured steps into civilization. The land was neither kind nor cruel. It was patient, fertile, and unrelenting. When the waters came too high, they swallowed villages whole. When they came too low, the earth cracked like old pottery. Yet it was this delicate balance between destruction and renewal that taught humanity the rhythm of survival. The Sumerians were the first to give shape to this rhythm. In the delta lands of Uruk and Uar, they built walls of sun-dried brick and temples that climbed like stairways to the heavens. Each city was its own small world, a realm of farmers, craftsmen, and priests, bound not by kings but by the will of gods. The temple, or ziggurat, was the pulse of the city, where grain met faith and offering met order. Here, in the quiet bustle of these temple courtyards, humanity learned to count, to measure, and to record. From reeds pressed into clay came cuneiform, the written breath of civilization itself. Trade followed swiftly after thought. Boats drifted down river channels laden with barley, bitumen, and copper from distant lands. Merchants spoke in gestures and tablets, sharing not only goods but ideas. A new sense of time began to take hold, the notion that human effort could build something enduring. Yet beneath this fragile web of trade and worship, there was restlessness. The city-states, proud and independent, often gazed beyond their walls with wary eyes. The plains were rich but not infinite, the rivers generous but fickle. To the north, across the rolling plains of Akkad, lived other peoples, speakers of a Semitic tongue, herders and traders who moved between the settled and the wild. They were not yet an empire, not yet even a nation, but their presence lingered like a shadow on the Sumerian horizon. They adopted the Sumerians' ways of writing, their gods, their systems of weight and measure. In the slow blending of these worlds, Sumerian and Akkadian, humanity rehearsed the birth of something greater. It is easy to imagine the world then as a vast, breathing organism. Villages hummed with the rhythm of potters' wheels. Fields rippled under the winds of spring. The temples sent their chants skyward, soft and repetitive as the rustle of reeds. Night fell slowly over the plains, the stars emerging above canals that glowed faintly with reflected moonlight. In those nights, humanity looked upward and wondered, not only at the gods, but at the possibility of order beyond the city walls. The calm discovery lies here. Civilization did not begin with conquest, but with cooperation. Irrigation required shared labor. Canals were dug and maintained by the many. Every furrow turned in the soil was a small act of unity, and yet, unity born of necessity can easily turn into ambition. The same coordination that lifted the first temples would one day build armies and kingdoms. The same writing that recorded harvests would record decrees. In the clay tablets of early Sumer, the seeds of empire already stirred. Archaeologists still find traces of these beginnings. The foundations of walls lost beneath centuries of silt, the outlines of canals carved into ancient soil. Each find is a whisper from the dawn of organization. The past does not shout here, it murmurs. And when we listen closely, we can hear the first human question echoing through time. Can order last? Another gentle realization emerges, that the Sumerians' faith in divine order mirrored their struggle with the unpredictable world around them. The gods were as temperamental as the rivers, demanding attention, respect, and sacrifice. To live in Mesopotamia was to live in awareness of both abundance and fragility. Every harvest depended on balance. Every life depended on the mood of waters that could bless or destroy. This sense of fragile harmony would shape the Mesopotamian spirit, cautious, reverent, and endlessly inventive. Farther north, the Akkadians observed and learned. Their tongue absorbed Sumerian words, their myths intertwined. They were not the inventors of civilization, but they were its apprentices, inheriting its tools, its stories, its dreams. While Sumerian priests recorded offerings and omens, Akkadian shepherds carried tales of gods and kings across the plains. One day these worlds would merge, not by accident but through vision. As we drift across this ancient landscape, we can almost hear the low hum of creation, the murmur of waters meeting soil, the soft scratch of a reed stylus against clay, the first songs sung to absent gods. It was a time before empires, before armies, when humanity's greatest monument was still the field and the canal. Yet everything that would follow, cities, laws, dynasties, and empires, was already written in the mud and sunlight of Mesopotamia. And so, from these scattered city gods and their quiet empires of clay, the dream of something greater began to take form. As the rivers continued their eternal flow, one man would soon dream beyond the limits of city and shrine, to weave all of Mesopotamia under one banner, and in doing so, give birth to the world's first empire. Between the slow-turning seasons of ancient Mesopotamia, the world was alive with gods. Every city had its patron deity. Every river bent its spirit. The Sumerians believed that divine presence animated all things. The wheat that rose from the soil, the wind that carried dust across the plains, the glimmer of starlight upon temple walls. To live was to serve, and to serve was to maintain order in a world shaped by unseen powers. In this landscape of divine hierarchy, humanity found both comfort and constraint. The city was not merely a settlement of people. It was a house built for a god. Uruk belonged to Inanna, the radiant goddess of love and war. Nippur was the seat of Enlil, lord of air and destiny. Lagash honored Ningirsu, protector of fields and justice. Each city prayed, built, and fought in the name of its deity. For in those days, divine favor was the currency of survival. The temple stood at the heart of civic life, its terraces rising above the plain like mountains of clay. Within their chambers, priests interpreted omens, offered incense, and kept the eternal covenant between heaven and earth. The Akkadians, living to the north, looked upon this spiritual order with reverence and curiosity. They spoke a Semitic language, rich and tonal, distinct from Sumerian. Yet they shared the same skies, the same rivers, the same need to explain the mysteries of existence. In time, they adopted Sumerian gods, but whispered their names differently. Inanna became Ishtar. Enki became Ea. The pantheon grew not weaker in translation, but deeper, layered with new meaning, as languages intertwined and myths began to travel. This was the beginning of something subtle yet profound, cultural fusion born of coexistence. Through trade, migration, and intermarriage, the Akkadians absorbed Sumerian ways without surrendering their own. Their shepherds learned to read Sumerian tablets. Their merchants brought northern timber and stone to southern cities. Slowly, the boundaries between peoples blurred. A merchant from Akkad could pray in a Sumerian temple. A Sumerian scribe might record a contract in an Akkadian tongue. The world was becoming bilingual, and in that bilingualism lay the seed of empire. A calm discovery hides here. Civilization's strength often lies not in purity, but in exchange. The Akkadians found identity not by isolating themselves from Sumer, but by listening, by learning its words, its rhythms, and its faith. To live among older tongues and gods required humility, yet it also invited creativity. New myths emerged, stories that blended northern landscapes with southern divine order. In them, the gods took on new accents. Their deeds stretched beyond the marshes of Sumer into the dry plains of Akkad. Language itself became a kind of quiet revolution. The Akkadian tongue, supple and expressive, began appearing on clay tablets beside Sumerian inscriptions. The two scripts shared space, one pictorial and ancient, the other phonetic and evolving. Archaeologists later called this linguistic layering, but for the people of the time it was simply communication. It was the sound of two worlds learning to speak to one another. The divine order mirrored this merging of voices. The Akkadians did not overthrow Sumer's gods. They inherited them. They reimagined them through their own experiences, warriors and herdsmen reshaping deities into figures of strength and endurance. Ishtar became both the mother of love and the mistress of battle. Shamash, the sun god, came to symbolize not only light, but moral clarity. This spiritual reinterpretation reflected a new perspective on life, one less bound to temple ritual, more attuned to the journeys of people across open land. In this blend of the settled and the nomadic, a new kind of spirituality emerged, one that carried both the discipline of the city and the freedom of the steppe. The Akkadians' gods were mobile, like them. They followed caravans and travelers, no longer tied solely to a single ziggurat or priestly city. Faith began to move with the people. The invisible boundaries of divinity stretched wider, as if the very idea of sacred order was preparing for something grander, something that could hold many lands under one divine canopy. Another quiet realization unfolds. The Akkadians were not yet conquerors, but interpreters of the world around them. Their gift was not invention but translation, taking what existed and weaving it into something coherent and lasting. From the reeds of the south to the stones of the north, they found harmony where others saw only difference. Their world was one of mingled prayers and borrowed myths, and from this mosaic, the first vision of unity began to shimmer on the horizon. Archaeological traces support this story. In the ruins of Kish, Mari, and Ebla, tablets written in Akkadian tell of early diplomacy. Gifts exchanged, marriages arranged, messages sent between cities hundreds of miles apart. This was the dawn of international communication, fragile yet astonishing. Through these cuneiform letters, we hear humanity beginning to think beyond its local gods and walls, sensing the possibility of shared destiny. The landscape itself seemed to reflect this merging spirit. To the south, canals carved by Sumerian hands glistened under the sun. To the north, Akkadian shepherds guided their flocks through wind-blown plains. Between them lay the great artery of the Euphrates, a natural road of exchange. Along its banks, languages mixed, myths traveled, and the dream of unity quietly took root. By the time the first Akkadian kings began to appear in local chronicles, the cultural groundwork for empire had already been laid. Before a single soldier marched or banner rose, there was already connection, of faith, of tongue, of shared aspiration. The Akkadian identity was not born in isolation, but in the slow embrace of a world it admired. And so, beneath the gaze of Ishtar and Enlil, beneath the shimmer of twin rivers that mirrored the heavens, the people of Akkad began to imagine something larger than city and shrine. They did not yet know the name of the man who would bring that vision to life, but the air was already charged with the possibility of kingship, not of one god, but of all gods united under one realm. As faith and language intertwined, the world of temples and trade began to shift toward the world of thrones and crowns. And on the horizon, a figure stirred, destined to bind these lands into one. In the quiet dawn of the 24th century BCE, when the sun rose pale over the floodplains of Mesopotamia, a story began, one that would echo through millennia. It was the story of a man whose name meant the true king, Sargon of Akkad. His legend begins not in a palace or temple, but in a basket drifting down a river. The tale, told and retold by generations of scribes, begins with a child born to mystery. His mother, the story says, was a priestess, bound by vows that forbade her to bear children. To save the infant from discovery, she placed him in a reed basket, sealed it with pitch and set it upon the current. The waters carried the child until he was found by a gardener, who raised him as his own. From this simple act of compassion grew the seed of empire. It is a tale steeped in myth, yet anchored in something profoundly human, the belief that greatness can emerge from obscurity. Historians recognize the familiar echoes. The river-born child who survives to shape destiny, a motif that later appears in stories of Moses, Romulus, and countless others. But beneath the symbolism, there is a core of truth. Sargon's origins were indeed humble, his rise improbable. He emerged from the working class of northern Mesopotamia, a world of irrigation canals, fields, and laborers, a life far removed from the marble courtyards of kings. In Akkadian, his name would one day be recorded as Sarukin, meaning legitimate king. The name itself was a declaration, not of birthright, but of merit. It was as though he spoke directly to history, saying, "I belong here, even if I was not born to it." Before the world knew him as Sargon the Great, he served as a cupbearer to Uarzababa, the ruler of Kish. The position might sound modest, but it was one of trust and proximity. The cupbearer stood close to the throne, listening, observing, learning. In a region where politics and prophecy were inseparable, this was a school of power. Sargon watched alliances form and crumble, saw how omens shaped decisions, and how kings faltered under the weight of divine favor or its loss. The Mesopotamia of Sargon's youth was a patchwork of rival city-states. Uar, Uruk, Lagash, Kish, each ruled by a local king, each claiming the favor of its patron god. Trade brought wealth but also conflict. Canals were diverted, boundaries disputed, temples plundered in the name of divine justice. The balance that once held Sumer together was unraveling. Into this turmoil stepped a man with a vision larger than any single city, the idea that all could be one. A calm discovery lies here. Great revolutions rarely begin with thunder. They begin with quiet observation. Sargon's rise was not a sudden burst of conquest, but the culmination of years spent watching the world's fractures and imagining how they might be healed or harnessed. He saw that the rivalries of gods mirrored the rivalries of men, and he understood something few others dared, that unity required not divine decree, but human will. What precisely ignited his rebellion remains uncertain. Some tablets hint at a falling out with his king. Others suggest prophecy, divine dreams, or political ambition. Whatever the spark, Sargon gathered followers. Men of mixed origins, farmers, and soldiers disillusioned by endless city wars. They came to him not because of his birth, but because of his promise. A realm where loyalty mattered more than lineage. The archaeological record offers faint but compelling traces. The city of Akkad, his capital, remains undiscovered, buried somewhere beneath centuries of silt and silence. Yet its memory endured for over 1,000 years. Later kings invoked Sargon's name as the gold standard of rule. His inscriptions, written in bold, declarative style, tell of a man who saw himself not as chosen by one god, but as the unifier of all lands between the rivers. And yet, to imagine Sargon only as a conqueror is to miss the gentle humanity within his myth. In the tale of the river child, there is tenderness, a mother's fear, a rescuer's compassion, a destiny shaped by chance and care. This was the foundation of his legend, that the gods could lift even the lowliest of humans, and that fate flowed like water, unpredictable yet purposeful. We can almost picture the scene. A boy standing by the canals of Kish, the scent of wet earth around him, the city walls shimmering in the morning light. He looks at the horizon, where the rivers wind toward lands unknown, and something stirs, a longing to see beyond the fields, to reshape the world's order. That yearning, quiet, patient, and resolute, became the heartbeat of his life. The gardener's son would one day command armies and administer an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. But his true conquest began here, in the stillness of thought, the moment he realized that the gods of many cities could dwell under one sky. A second calm realization flows from his story, that leadership is not born from divine perfection, but from human perseverance. Sargon's legend endured because it comforted the imagination, reminding later generations that greatness can rise from anywhere, that even in a world of divine kings, destiny might favor the foundling. And so, from the quiet banks of a river to the bustling courts of Kish, Sargon's journey unfolded. A reflection of humanity's own movement from fragmentation toward unity, from local faith to shared civilization. His life was not merely history's turning point. It was its metaphor. From riverbanks to palaces, Sargon's journey would mirror the transformation of humanity itself, from many into one. The gardener's son was ready to shape the destiny of nations, and in doing so to redefine what it meant to be king. The winds over Mesopotamia shifted as the age of city-states waned. What had once been a tapestry of proud, independent realms, Uruk, Lagash, Kish, began to tremble under the weight of one man's vision. Sargon of Akkad, the gardener's son, now stood at the threshold of destiny. But his path was not forged in sudden violence or the roar of battle. It was shaped by persistence, patience, and purpose. The slow, deliberate weaving of lands into unity. The story begins with Lugal-Zagisai, the ambitious king of Umma, who had already conquered much of Sumer. In his inscriptions, he boasted of subduing lands from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, a claim perhaps more dream than deed. Yet for a moment he seemed unstoppable. He crowned himself ruler of all Sumer, binding city after city under his name. And then from the north came Sargon, not as a challenger of one city, but as the voice of something new, the union of Sumer and Akkad. The two powers met upon the plains near the river. We do not know the day or the season, only that when the dust settled, the world was no longer the same. Lugal-Zagisai's banners fell, and his cities opened their gates. In the records, Sargon would later write, "I captured Lugal-Zagisai and brought him in chains before the gate of Enlil." It was both a statement and a symbol, a declaration that the old order had ended, and a new one had begun. Yet even in conquest, Sargon's tone was measured. His vision was not to burn or erase, but to bind. He did not destroy Sumer, he absorbed it. The temples remained, the priests continued their chants, and the gods of Sumer, Enlil, Inanna, Shamash, were honored still. Sargon's genius lay not in mere victory, but in continuity. He understood that unity could not be achieved by force alone. It required reverence for what had come before. A calm discovery reveals itself here. Empire is not the silencing of many voices, but their orchestration. Sargon did not impose new gods upon the Sumerians. He elevated their gods to imperial guardianship. Inanna of Uruk became Ishtar of Akkad. Enlil's decrees were invoked for all lands. The divine, once local, became universal. Through this gentle transformation, Sargon transformed belief into governance, faith into cohesion. His empire began to take form not as a battlefield scar, but as a network of roads, garrisons, and governors. Administrative centers rose in cities both old and new. From Akkad, his unseen capital, scribes sent tablets to distant provinces, recording grain, tribute, and troops. Messengers moved between river valleys and mountain fringes, carrying orders sealed in clay. The Akkadian language, elegant, adaptable, and now the tongue of power, spread across the land. In its syllables, the idea of empire was whispered into permanence. We can imagine the rhythm of those early days, the hum of activity in city markets, the quiet authority of the king's couriers, the sound of styluses pressing into clay. The world was learning a new order, not of divine kingship limited to one city, but of centralized rule over all. Yet Sargon's empire was more than administration. It was imagination made real. He had turned a landscape of rivals into a shared civilization. Still, beneath this calm surface, there lingered unease. Some Sumerian lords resented Akkadian oversight. Old loyalties do not vanish overnight. To maintain peace, Sargon established garrisons in key cities, not as symbols of oppression, but as anchors of stability. Soldiers, often locals serving under Akkadian officers, ensured order and protection. The flow of trade was preserved. Canals remained open. For most citizens, life continued much as before. Only now, their offerings to the gods were accompanied by prayers for the king of all lands. Archaeological fragments from this period, seals, inscriptions, temple dedications, show a delicate balance between Sumerian heritage and Akkadian innovation. In one tablet, Sargon is described as King of Kish, King of the Four Quarters. The title was both ancient and new. Kish had long symbolized legitimate rule in Sumerian thought. For quarters suggested the entirety of the known world. In joining these two, Sargon spoke to both the past and the future. Another calm realization lies within his approach. Sargon ruled not through terror, but through vision. His empire was built on the belief that the land between the rivers could share destiny. The power of that idea endured longer than his armies, longer even than his dynasty. For the first time in history, the concept of imperial unity had taken root, not as myth but as governance. In the cities he conquered, temples continued to rise. The gods were not silenced. They were given new purpose under a single sky. Ishtar's love and wrath, Enlil's decree, Shamash's justice, all became threads in a larger pattern. The Akkadian Empire, at its heart, was an act of synthesis, the blending of peoples, languages, and dreams into one great fabric of civilization. If we listen closely, we might still hear the distant echoes of Sargon's triumphs. Not the clash of weapons, but the soft, steady murmur of record-keepers, traders, and priests adapting to a broader world. Conquest, when seen through Sargon's eyes, was less an act of destruction and more an act of integration. Where others saw difference, he saw continuity. Where others sought dominion, he sought design. And yet, the empire he forged was young and fragile. The rivers that united his lands could just as easily divide them. The same cities that welcomed him might one day rebel. Sargon understood this, and so his conquest did not end with victory. It turned immediately toward preservation. To keep the peace he had made, he would need to master a new art. Not the sword, but the balance of power. Peace, once forged through victory, must now be tended, lest the empire unravel as swiftly as it was born. From the ashes of rivalry, Sargon would now learn to rule not as a conqueror, but as a keeper of order in a world newly made. In the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, there once stood a city unlike any before it. A city of kings, scribes, and dreams. Its name was Akkad, or Agade as the ancients called it, the capital of the world's first true empire. And yet, not a single brick of it remains. No walls, no streets, no foundation stones. Only words, scattered across the ages like whispers carried by the desert wind. How, one might ask, can a city so great leave not a stone behind, yet echo through eternity? It is one of history's most haunting silences. The Akkadians themselves sang of its splendor. Clay tablets, inscribed long after its fall, tell of temples gleaming like the heavens, of gates adorned with bronze and lapis lazuli, and of a palace where Sargon ruled as the chosen of Ishtar. But time, relentless and impartial, has hidden Akkad beneath layers of earth and myth. Somewhere between the rivers, perhaps near the confluence of the Tigris and Diyala, or near the ancient city of Kish, archaeologists have searched for generations. The sands hold their secrets close. No definitive trace of Akkad has yet been uncovered. And so, the city exists in two worlds at once. One physical, lost to time. The other eternal, preserved in language and imagination. In its prime, Akkad was the pulse of an empire that stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the shores of the Persian Gulf. From its docks, traders set forth with cargoes of cedar, copper, tin, and silver. From its workshops came fine art and tools that bore the mark of empire, precise, orderly, and enduring. And from its temples rose hymns that blended Sumerian and Akkadian tongues, praising gods that now spoke for all lands. The city's most sacred place was said to be the temple of Ishtar, goddess of war and love, patron of kings. There, priests tended fires that symbolized the light of the empire. It was she, according to legend, who had granted Sargon his victories and the right to rule. Every festival, every coronation, every prayer carried her name, the divine protector of Akkad. If we close our eyes, we might imagine its avenues. Broad and straight, lined with mud brick buildings painted in red and white. The air alive with the scent of baked clay and incense. Scribes bent over tablets in the royal archive, pressing styluses into wet clay. Each stroke a note in the symphony of administration. Records of trade, decrees of kings, lists of conquered cities. The hum of empire was a sound of writing, of language turned into permanence. And that, perhaps, is Akkad's truest legacy. Even if the city itself has vanished, its words have not. The Akkadian language became the voice of diplomacy, trade, and learning for over 1,000 years. It was the medium through which empires after Sargon, Babylon, Assyria, and beyond expressed their power. Akkad's city walls crumbled, but its language became immortal. This is a calm discovery worth lingering on. Sometimes the most enduring monuments are not made of stone, but of sound and script. Akkad's greatness was not in its architecture alone, but in its ability to give structure to human thought, to unify communication, administration, and worship under a shared tongue. The city itself became a metaphor for civilization's memory. In later centuries, poets of Sumer wrote of Akkad's fall with awe and sorrow. One ancient lament tells of how the gods themselves turned against the city, angry at its pride. The fields around it turned to dust, its rivers to trickles. Yet even in ruin, Akkad was remembered not with disdain, but reverence, as if its disappearance only deepened its mystique. To the Mesopotamians, a city was not merely a place. It was a living being, bound to its patron deity. If Akkad was lost, perhaps it was because Ishtar herself withdrew her favor, or perhaps because history had completed its cycle. In this way, the city entered mythology, transcending geography. It became the idea of empire itself. Glorious, fleeting, eternal in memory. Modern scholars continue to search for its remains. Satellite images, excavations, and ancient maps all hint at possibilities. A rise near Kish, a ruin near Sippar, an unexplored tell hidden beneath fields. But so far, Akkad remains an absence we can feel but not see. And in that absence lies beauty. For every generation that dreams of finding it becomes, in a small way, part of its story. Another calm realization emerges. What we lose in time, we often preserve in longing. Akkad's disappearance has made it timeless. Like a melody whose notes have faded, but whose rhythm endures, the city continues to shape how we imagine origins, empire, and loss. It is easy to think of empires as monuments of power, yet the tale of Akkad reminds us that every civilization, no matter how mighty, is as fragile as clay before the flood. Still, through language, through myth, through memory, it survives. The Akkadian word for king, saram, still echoes faintly in the words of modern tongues, in the idea of rule, in the pulse of history itself. So the capital that cannot be found continues to live. Not in ruins, but in resonance. Each inscription unearthed elsewhere, each cuneiform tablet deciphered, carries a trace of its spirit. Akkad's silence has become its monument, and in that silence, we may still hear the heartbeat of the first empire. Within its unseen walls, the empire's heartbeat quickened, carried by language, worship, and rule. From the mystery of its capital, the power of Akkad began to flow outward, shaping lands and lives far beyond the rivers of its birth. Empire, at its gentlest, is paperwork and patience. Behind every victory carved in stone lies a quieter triumph, the creation of order. When Sargon of Akkad united the cities of Mesopotamia, he did not merely conquer land. He sought to weave it together. The threads of that tapestry were not swords or spears, but tablets, seals, and scribes. From his capital, Sargon built the first known imperial bureaucracy, a network of governors, tax collectors, and messengers that stretched across the Fertile Crescent. Each city, whether near or far, was entrusted to a loyal official known as an Ensi or Sakanaku, who governed in the king's name. Reports flowed regularly to Akkad, carried on clay tablets wrapped in reed envelopes, sealed with tiny impressions of cylinder seals, intricate designs that identified the sender. These were the fingerprints of empire, small marks that bound vast distances together. The empire's genius was not just in conquest, but in continuity. Sargon and his administrators did not erase local customs. They organized them. Each region kept its gods and traditions, yet all were bound by a shared administrative rhythm, the steady heartbeat of imperial order. In the markets of Akkad and beyond, merchants used standardized weights and measures, allowing trade to move smoothly from one end of the empire to another. The silver shekel, the mina, and the talent became the empire's silent language of trust. It was through this consistency that the Akkadians achieved something subtle yet profound: the transformation of chaos into commerce. One can imagine the daily calm of this system: the hum of workshops, the counting of grain, the rhythmic tapping of styluses in record halls. In that sound, there was a kind of peace, the peace that arises from understanding one's place in a greater design. Among Sargon's many innovations was the establishment of what some scholars call the first organized postal network. Couriers, traveling on foot or with pack animals, carried royal decrees and correspondence across the empire's roads. At relay stations, new messengers awaited to continue the journey, ensuring that word from Akkad could reach the furthest provinces with remarkable speed for its age. These runners, unnamed and unremembered, were the quiet arteries of the empire, carrying not blood, but information. It is one of the calm discoveries of this era. Empire was not only power expressed outward, but knowledge flowing inward. Each report, each inventory, each census strengthened Sargon's understanding of his world. Through such organization, he could predict famine, manage resources, and maintain peace. The Akkadians had learned that the secret to endurance was not might, but management. To support this machinery, a new class of professionals arose, scribes trained in both Sumerian and Akkadian. In their hands, the wedge-shaped cuneiform script became a bridge between cultures. Writing, once the domain of priests and temple accountants, now served the empire itself. Through them, the empire remembered. There is a quiet poetry in this. The same tool that once marked offerings to the gods now charted the affairs of humanity. The pen, or rather, the stylus, had become a symbol of civilization's growing self-awareness. Akkad's empire thrived not through endless conquest, but through the calm, deliberate act of keeping records. And yet, within this order, we sense the first whispers of strain. The larger an empire grows, the more delicate its balance becomes. Every road, every message, every grain stored in distant silos required oversight. Each governor ruled in Sargon's name, but distance tests loyalty. To maintain harmony across so many cities and tongues demanded endless patience, and a faith that words alone could hold the world together. Still, for a time, it worked. The Akkadian Empire became a model of structured unity, inspiring centuries of successors, from Babylon to Persia, who would borrow its rhythms of rule. Even now, when we think of administration, communication, and bureaucracy, we are hearing echoes of Akkad. It is worth pausing on one more calm realization. Order itself can be an act of imagination. To take a world of rivers, fields, and wandering tribes and see within it the possibility of structure, that is a kind of art. Sargon's gift was not only his conquest, but his capacity to envision a civilization bound by ideas instead of walls. The empire breathed through tablets and trade, through words and weights, through the quiet diligence of countless hands. It was a system sustained not by fear, but by routine, the same kind of routine that defines daily life even now. In this way, the Akkadian world does not feel so distant. Its rhythms, though ancient, remain familiar to anyone who finds peace in the order of things. But even in order, the seeds of strain begin to grow. Beneath the surface of unity, ambition, and fatigue stir. The subtle signs that every empire, no matter how carefully built, must one day face the limits of its own design. When Sargon of Akkad passed from the world, silence seemed to settle over the empire he had built. The rivers still flowed, the temples still glowed under the sun, but something had changed. The great unifier was gone, and with his passing came the question that shadows every throne. What happens to a dream once its dreamer is no more? Rimish, Sargon's son, inherited both the crown and the uncertainty of an empire stretched thin. He was a young man surrounded by veteran generals and ambitious governors, each ruling distant lands once conquered by his father. The unity that had been carefully woven through Sargon's years of order now began to fray. From the southern cities of Sumer to the eastern highlands of Elam, murmurs of rebellion rose like wind before a storm. Can the son of a conqueror inherit not only his lands, but his vision? It is one of history's gentler yet most persistent questions. Rimish tried to answer it not with grand speeches or reforms, but with action, steady, deliberate, unflinching. Where his father had expanded, Rimish would seek to preserve. His reign was one of containment, not conquest, of endurance, not ambition. Records carved in ancient stone tell of his campaigns, the uprisings in Uar, Amma, and Lagash, the defiance of Elam to the east. The empire, only recently bound together, was testing its own strength. Rimish met each revolt with discipline. Clay tablets describe victories won and enemies subdued, cities reclaimed, and governors reinstated. Yet the tone of these inscriptions is different from his father's. There is less triumph, more strain. The world he ruled was no longer one of endless possibility, but one already bearing the weight of its own size. In these quiet struggles, we glimpse the fragility of order. Rimish's task was not to conquer, that had already been done, but to hold the center. To maintain balance between cities older than his dynasty and soldiers newly loyal to Akkad. Each decision, each message sent across dusty roads, was an act of preservation. There is calm wisdom to be found in his story. Empire, like memory, must be renewed each day or it begins to fade. Rimish's efforts, though harsh at times, were driven by a recognition that peace is not a permanent state, but a rhythm that must be kept. He ruled from the capital that his father had built, though we still do not know where it lay. There, the same scribes and messengers who once served Sargon now recorded the son's decrees. The machinery of administration continued to hum, the postal routes carried orders to distant provinces, and the merchants of Akkad still weighed silver in their markets. On the surface, the empire endured. Yet beneath, fatigue had begun to spread, not of spirit but of scale. Revolt followed revolt, and Rimish responded with measured firmness. Some chronicles describe his campaigns as ruthless, yet there is no evidence of cruelty for its own sake. Rather, there is a sense of inevitability, as though the young king understood the burden he carried. To inherit greatness is to inherit unrest. One might imagine Rimish in the stillness of his court, the oil lamps flickering over cuneiform tablets, the faces of advisors lit by a quiet glow. Around him lay a world both united and divided, faithful yet restless. His reign, though brief, stands as a meditation on the tension between power and peace. For those who listen deeply, his story reveals another calm discovery. Continuity itself is a kind of courage. Not all empires are built by conquerors. Some are preserved by caretakers, those who choose steadiness over expansion, patience over pride. Rimish's rule, lasting only a handful of years, kept the empire from crumbling in its infancy. He gave Akkad time to breathe, to remember its center before the next generation took its place. Yet, as all who bear crowns must, Rimish faced the limits of control. Ancient tablets suggest that even within his court, loyalties were shifting. Some sources hint at intrigue, a conspiracy among servants or soldiers that ended his life. Whether true or exaggerated by time, the silence that followed his death carried a familiar weight. The empire stood once more at the edge of uncertainty. Still, his name endures among the kings who held Akkad together when the light might have gone out. His reign was not one of glory, but of gravity, the gravity of inheritance. In his effort to preserve his father's creation, Rimish taught a timeless truth. The strength of empire lies not in the sword, but in the steady hand that keeps the map from tearing. When Rimish's reign dimmed, another heir would rise, one less warlike, yet equally determined to hold the dream together. In Manishtushu, the Akkadian Empire would find not a conqueror, but a builder of balance, seeking to restore what time and turmoil had begun to erode. After years of unrest, the empire of Akkad entered a gentler season. The sword was sheathed, the dust of revolt had settled. When Rimish's reign came to its quiet end, his brother Manishtushu ascended the throne, a ruler not of conquest, but of restoration. How does an empire learn to breathe after the storms of its birth? For the first time since Sargon's march across the plains, the empire could look inward. Manishtushu, son of the great unifier, inherited not a battlefield but a framework, a network of cities, governors, and roads bound together by language and law. His task was not to expand, but to refine. And in that act of refinement, the Akkadian world began to mature. Where his father had built and his brother had fought, Manishtushu administered. The clay tablets that survive from his reign speak of trade, land grants, and temple restoration. They are quieter records, the language of management, not triumph. His inscriptions lack the thunder of conquest and instead reveal a ruler deeply aware of time's slower rhythms. He turned his gaze toward the sea, to the waters of the Persian Gulf, the maritime frontier of ancient Mesopotamia. From there, Akkadian merchants sailed southward toward the lands of Dilmun, modern Bahrain, and Magan, the coast of Oman, where copper and precious stones awaited. These expeditions were not raids, but journeys of exchange, connecting distant peoples through the flow of goods and ideas. For the first time, Mesopotamian civilization reached beyond its rivers and into the ocean's horizon. Trade brought wealth but also perspective. Through these voyages, Akkad began to see itself not only as conqueror or ruler, but as participant in a vast web of civilizations. It was a quiet transformation, the shift from dominance to dialogue. Manishtushu also understood the importance of faith as a stabilizing force. He sponsored the restoration of temples across Sumer and Akkad, repairing sanctuaries damaged by years of rebellion. In cities like Kish and Nippur, stone and brick rose once more in the names of ancient gods. By honoring both the deities of the conquered and the divine patrons of Akkad, he reaffirmed a sacred balance that had kept the land alive for millennia. In this, there is a calm realization. Peace is not the absence of motion, but the presence of harmony. Manishtushu's rule, though modest in drama, was rich in meaning. He governed with a steady hand, allowing systems to take root, bureaucracy to settle, scribes to codify law, and officials to act not merely as soldiers of the king, but as servants of the state. This was the quiet genius of Akkad's middle years, the invention of continuity. What began under Sargon as bold experiment now became institution. Governors learned to govern, accountants learned to count for a nation, and language, the Akkadian tongue, grew into a unifying vessel for empire. Through slow and deliberate practice, Akkad was learning how to last. In one surviving inscription, Manishtushu lists the lands he ruled and the gifts he gave to temples, his tone reflective rather than boastful. There is no hint of divine rage or heroic conquest, only gratitude, order, and faith. Perhaps, after so much upheaval, the empire longed for quiet stewardship, and in giving it that, Manishtushu became the unseen architect of Akkad's endurance. We may think of him, then, not as a king of conquest but as a gardener of civilization, tending the systems that sustained life, pruning excess, and ensuring the soil remained fertile for what would follow. His reign was a bridge between survival and splendor. But even gardens must change. As Akkad found peace, a new generation was watching. Among the royal court, there was a prince who saw beyond trade and temple, a child born into stability but restless with vision. He would soon inherit the calm world his uncle had built, only to reshape it entirely. Manishtushu's legacy would not be one of legend, yet it was essential. His peace became the foundation upon which his nephew, Naram-Sin, would build his dream of godhood. Without the stillness of this reign, the next would have no stage. And so, the empire of Akkad, once born in conquest, learned under Manishtushu to breathe, to balance, and to believe. His story is a gentle reminder that history's most lasting chapters are often written not in the clamor of victory, but in the quiet labor of preservation. Yet as calm spread across Akkad, a young prince watched the horizon, dreaming not of peace, but of eternity. From Manishtushu's measured order would rise Naram-Sin, the empire's brightest flame and, in time, its most fateful shadow. When Naram-Sin, grandson of Sargon, rose to the throne, the empire of Akkad had ripened. The harvests were plentiful, the roads well kept, the governors loyal. In the palace archives, Scribes traced the lineage of a dynasty that had weathered storms and now stood in full bloom. The world seemed steady, as though the gods themselves had smiled upon Akkad. Born into wealth and learning, Naram-Sin had been shaped by both war and wisdom. From childhood, he had listened to tales of his grandfather's conquests, of rivers crossed, cities subdued, and the empire's dreams stretching from the mountains of Anatolia to the shores of the Persian Gulf. Yet, unlike Sargon, he inherited not chaos but order, a system built and refined by those before him. What happens when a kingdom of mortals begins to see its ruler as divine? It was in this question that Naram-Sin's reign found its meaning and its danger. He began as a ruler of men, yet ruled with a vision that reached toward the heavens. The early years of his reign were years of confidence. Fortresses strengthened, cities restored, temples endowed. Trade with foreign lands flourished, bringing copper from Magan, timber from Lebanon, and precious stones from the east. The empire's wealth flowed like a river through his capital, Agade, now gleaming at the height of its glory. To his people, Naram-Sin was not only a king, he was the living symbol of Akkad's perfection. He brought peace through strength, abundance through command. His soldiers marched not with desperation, but with discipline. His scribes wrote not of rebellion, but of prosperity. Under him, the empire reached its widest extent. He led campaigns across the Zagros Mountains, through Elam, and northward into the lands of the Lalubi, distant, rugged realms whose people carved his image into their cliffs. On that rock relief, still faintly visible through time's erosion, Naram-Sin stands tall beneath the stars, helmet crowned with horns, the mark of divinity. It was there, in stone and symbol, that a mortal crossed the threshold. For the first time in recorded Mesopotamian history, a living ruler claimed godhood. Not as metaphor or flattery, but as truth. Naram-Sin took the title the God of Akkad, commanding not only as king, but as divine protector of his people. To some, this was audacious, even dangerous. Yet to others it was destiny fulfilled. After all, had Sargon not been chosen by Ishtar herself? Had the dynasty not brought unity and order to all of Sumer? In a world where the gods walked close to humankind, perhaps it felt natural for a ruler so blessed to step among them. But in the quiet, beneath the surface of grandeur, this act marked a subtle shift. Where once the king had ruled for the gods, now he ruled as one. The empire's center of gravity began to tilt, from devotion outward to reverence inward. Still, for many years, the illusion held beautifully. The temples thrived, the lands prospered, and the Akkadian name carried a sacred power that few dared challenge. Naram-Sin's court became a theater of splendor. Music echoing through marble halls, perfumed gardens blooming beside canals, scholars and priests debating beneath carved lintels. It was a civilization at its height, confident in its immortality. The empire had become not only a political order, but a cosmic one, a mirror of heaven on earth. And yet, in that perfection lay its fragility. History whispers that it is in moments of greatest light that shadow begins to stir. Naram-Sin, the divine king, would soon face challenges that no mortal army could quell, omens of drought, whispers of rebellion, the slow unraveling of belief. But those belong to another chapter. For now, as we look upon the world through his eyes, we see an empire in golden stillness, a ruler at the pinnacle of human ambition, believing himself chosen by eternity. He stands upon the mountain, crowned in light, gazing across the lands his ancestors conquered, and perhaps, in that silence, he wonders if the gods envy him. From man to God, the story now turns to the brightest and most perilous moment in Akkad's long dream. When every border yields, does the horizon still satisfy the heart of a king? For Naram-Sin of Akkad, grandson of Sargon the Great, that question lingered like a shadow beneath the golden crown. His reign was the longest and perhaps the most radiant of all Akkadian rulers, a time when the empire reached from the Persian Gulf to the shores of the Mediterranean, its roads stretching like arteries across the ancient world. From the marshlands of Sumer to the cedar forests of Lebanon, the world spoke the language of Akkad. Couriers carried clay tablets bearing royal decrees. Merchants traveled with seals stamped in the king's name. Soldiers, disciplined and loyal, guarded the farthest outposts beneath banners that bore the emblem of a god-king. The empire had never known such breadth, nor such confidence. In Agade, the capital that no archaeologist has yet found, the temples were said to gleam like the sunrise. The temple of Ishtar, goddess of love and war, rose high above the city, its walls covered in gold and lapis lazuli. The streets thrummed with artisans carving diorite and alabaster, with scribes pressing styluses into wet clay, recording the pulse of an empire. To his people, Naram-Sin was not merely a ruler, he was king of the four quarters of the world. It was a title of vast meaning, not just political power, but cosmic authority. North, south, east, and west, all were bound beneath his dominion, reflecting a divine order where the center of the universe was Akkad itself. There was beauty in the order he created, a quiet, almost mathematical harmony. Across the empire, weights and measures were standardized. Akkadian became the language of diplomacy. Art flourished under royal patronage. Cylinder seals bore scenes of gods and kings in unity, their forms etched with precision and grace. In every province, governors ruled in Naram-Sin's name, their authority drawn from a central power that pulsed like a steady heartbeat through the land. Through the fragments of ancient texts, we learn that Naram-Sin's reign marked the first known vision of empire as system, not a collection of conquered lands, but an organized, living whole. And yet, the empire was not held together by conquest alone. It was sustained by faith, a shared belief that its rulers stood at the meeting point of heaven and earth. Naram-Sin was worshipped as a god in his own lifetime, his name invoked in temples, his image carved with the horned helmet reserved only for the divine. Such worship was both an act of devotion and of reassurance. For in an age when rivers flooded without warning and the sky could turn to dust, to believe in a divine king was to believe that the world itself was under control. The people of Akkad did not see arrogance in his godhood, they saw continuity. Just as Sargon had claimed divine favor, Naram-Sin embodied divine presence. His rule was a celestial echo, a reflection of cosmic order on earth. And indeed, his victories seemed to prove it. He marched across the Zagros Mountains and beyond, defeating the Lalubi tribes whose defiance had long tested the empire's borders. On the cliffs of Darban-Igor, his triumph was immortalized. A relief showing the king striding upward on a mountain slope, enemies beneath his feet, stars above his head. It is an image not of violence, but of ascension, a mortal touching the realm of the gods. That relief, still faintly visible today, is among humanity's earliest mountain monuments, a silent testament to how stone, belief, and power intertwined in the dawn of civilization. As his empire flourished, Naram-Sin became a figure of serene grandeur. He built new sanctuaries, expanded irrigation, and maintained the intricate web of officials that governed the empire's farthest reaches. The Akkadian state was not a chaotic conquest but an architecture of order, a structure built of clay, faith, and memory. In art and writing, the king's image grew ever more celestial. Inscriptions described him as the mighty one of Enlil, the god of Agade, and the conqueror of all lands. Yet amid the glory, one can still sense the human beneath. A man born of lineage, bound to destiny, who gazed upon his vast creation and perhaps wondered where conquest should end. For an empire built on rivers, every current eventually finds its delta. Expansion slows, and questions of eternity begin to rise. Did Naram-Sin ever stand upon the walls of Agade, looking toward the horizon, and feel the stillness of all he ruled? Did he sense the weight of it, the quiet burden of a god among men? Archaeologists believe that during his reign, the earliest sense of imperial ideology truly took root, the idea that kingship was not a temporary gift, but a cosmic responsibility. In Naram-Sin's world, victory was not merely a triumph of arms, but a reaffirmation of order itself. To rule was to keep the universe aligned, to balance the powers of heaven and earth through justice, worship, and strength. But as history often reminds us, Even in stillness, the wheel of time continues to turn. The more an empire perfects itself, the more fragile it becomes. For what has reached its zenith has nowhere left to climb, only to endure or to fall. And so, as the god-king stood beneath his horned crown, the heavens above Akkad began, ever so quietly, to take notice. Yet even greatness carries its own weight, the question of how far one may ascend before the heavens notice. Under the warm dust of time, Naram-Sin's image still rises, carved into stone, surrounded by conquered mountains and kneeling foes. It is one of humanity's oldest works of imperial art, the victory stele of Naram-Sin. At first glance, it is a triumph. The king ascends a rugged slope, his soldiers following in perfect formation, while his enemies tumble down in defeat. Above him, a cluster of stars glows, divine symbols blessing his climb. But as the eye lingers, something quieter emerges. The mountain is not merely a battleground. It is a metaphor. The ascent is spiritual. Naram-Sin, carved larger than all others, rises toward the heavens, his horned helmet signifying that he has crossed the boundary between man and God. No ruler before him in Mesopotamia had dared to wear such a crown. The horns were reserved for deities, markers of cosmic power. Yet here, in solid pink limestone, stands a man who believed his triumph was proof of divine essence. To the people of Akkad, this was not heresy but revelation. Their king had become the embodiment of order, the living center of their world. The sun rose upon his image, prayers carried his name, and his likeness was shaped into statues placed within temples across the empire. His face, serene, distant, eternal, became the very language of loyalty. Art historians note that the victory stele marks the first time in recorded history that a ruler's image replaced the presence of the gods themselves. The divine was now human-shaped, its holiness molded through power, victory, and form. In the soft light of torch and temple, worshippers would have gazed upon this image not in fear, but in awe. For in Naram-Sin's divinity, they saw continuity, the gods no longer remote in the heavens but walking among them, guiding their harvests, protecting their children. In this way, divine kingship became an act of reassurance, not arrogance. It was the dream of order made flesh. The Akkadian sculptors who carved his likeness did so with purpose. The smooth lines of his arms, the upward tilt of his head, the disciplined geometry of his soldiers, each carried the rhythm of perfection. Their art was not to depict a moment, but to suspend one forever. In the silence of stone, Naram-Sin would always be ascending. And yet, there is a stillness in that ascent, a pause between breath and eternity. The stars above him do not move. The mountain beneath his feet does not crumble. Time itself holds its breath. It is this stillness that gives the stele its haunting calm. Not the noise of battle, but the peace that follows victory, when ambition begins to look toward the divine. In the theology of Akkad, the gods had long been guardians of balance. They could raise empires but also dissolve them when harmony broke. By taking their symbols, Naram-Sin did not merely claim divinity. He took upon himself their responsibility. He became the guarantor of cosmic order, answerable not only to men but to the heavens themselves. Cuneiform inscriptions from his reign show priests invoking Naram-Sin's name alongside deities like Enlil and Ishtar. Evidence that for a brief moment, humanity's faith and governance merged into a single, luminous figure. But even divine images carry shadows. To claim godhood was to walk a line between devotion and defiance. For in a world of capricious gods, the boundaries between mortal and divine existed for a reason. Naram-Sin's self-deification, though celebrated, subtly rewrote the sacred order. The gods had chosen kings. Now, a king had chosen to be a god. The stele, then, is not merely art, it is theology carved in stone. Each contour whispers of a world redefined, where human hands could shape divine destiny. In the relief's composition, perspective itself becomes a statement. The king's body is vertical, ascending. His followers are smaller, climbing behind him. His enemies lie horizontal, fallen into the earth. Time and motion converge toward one figure, the human who dares to stand where gods dwell. And yet, even here, humility lingers. The stars above him are distant, unreachable. The divine light touches his crown but never consumes him. In that faint separation lies the enduring tension of Mesopotamian kingship, the yearning to be eternal, and the knowledge that eternity belongs to others. When the people of Akkad saw this image, they saw both power and protection. They believed their king's divine nature ensured the rhythm of rain and harvest, of sunrise and return. But behind this faith was fragility. If a god-king faltered, what then of the world he held together? In later hymns and lamentations, scribes describe Naram-Sin's temples filled with light, his name sung at dawn and dusk, yet also hint that the gods, in their silence, watched closely. His ascent was brilliant, but it disturbed the old celestial balance. It is possible to imagine him, standing before his sculptors, gazing at the finished steel, the mountain rising, the stars glowing, his form eternalized in stone. Did he feel pride? Did he sense the quiet warning hidden within the image, that to climb so high is to court stillness too profound for any living man? In that silence lies both beauty and omen, the kind of silence that ancient storytellers remembered when they later wrote of Akkad's fall. The image of the god-king endures, but so too does the echo of what follows. A whisper of overreach, a reminder that even in divinity, balance must be kept. For Naram-Sin, the steel was triumph made eternal. For us, millennia later, it is meditation, a moment frozen between reverence and fragility. But history, unlike sculpture, never stands still, and omens soon began to whisper. What if the fall of an empire is not a battle, but a whisper from the gods? The story of Akkad's fall does not begin with thunder, but with silence. The rivers that once shimmered like veins of silver began to withdraw. The skies, once generous, turned pale and distant. The wind carried dust across the fields where barley had grown, and the canals, the lifelines of Mesopotamia, ran shallow. To the people of Akkad, it must have felt as though the gods themselves had looked away. Centuries later, a poem would be written to remember it, The Curse of Akkad. In its lines, Naram-Sin becomes not the radiant god-king of triumph, but a tragic figure, a man who dared to defy the heavens. It tells that when the gods grew silent, the king sought answers. He entered their temples, offered sacrifices, waited for omens, and heard nothing. Desperate, he turned not to patience, but to pride. In the poem, he marches upon the temple of Enlil, the lord of the wind and the earth, and destroys it. In that moment, divine order is broken. The gods, enraged, decree the ruin of Akkad. Whether myth or metaphor, the tale carries a truth older than any empire. When harmony with the sacred world is lost, even the mightiest walls cannot endure. Archaeologists uncovering layers from this period found evidence of severe drought around 2200 BCE, a centuries-long desiccation that stretched from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. What the ancient poets called divine anger may have been the slow hand of climate itself. Across the once green plains, famine grew. Cities that had once thrived under Akkadian order began to fracture. Trade routes faltered, grain stores emptied, and local rulers, long subdued, sensed the empire's weakening pulse. The curse of Akkad speaks of empty fields, of mothers who wept for their children, of temples abandoned to sand. It describes the fall not as a sudden destruction, but as a gradual unweaving, the gods withdrawing their blessing, and with it, the rhythm of life. And yet, there is a gentleness to the poem's sorrow. It does not rage. It mourns. It understands that the empire's fall was not simply punishment, but transformation. The closing of one chapter in humanity's long conversation with power and belief. In modern terms, scholars call this period the 4.2 kilo-year event, a global climate shift that reshaped civilizations from Egypt to the Indus. What the ancients read as divine withdrawal was, in truth, the earth's own quiet turning. Still, the Akkadians could not see it as mere weather. Their world was woven with gods and omens. To them, A drought was not a pattern of clouds, but a message. And so, the poem lingers on divine retribution, on the image of Naram-Sin, the god-king, humbled beneath the very sky he once commanded. The streets are empty, the temples echo only with wind. The poem ends not with anger, but with memory, as if to say, greatness, too, must rest. Beneath the myth, however, lies the archaeology of loss. Settlements along the upper Tigris show signs of abandonment. Pottery styles disappear, inscriptions cease, and trade networks fade from record. The imperial system that once spanned the known world had fractured into silence. And from that silence, new voices began to rise. The Akkadians from the mountains to the northeast, tribal peoples who moved through the weakened lands. To the Akkadians, they seemed like instruments of the god's wrath, the final wind that carried away what drought had begun. But the curse of Akkad is not a story of destruction alone. It is a story of reflection, an ancient meditation on pride and impermanence. The poem does not name the king's sins in cruelty, but in blindness. His inability to see that divine silence is not an absence, but a warning. The text invites the listener to consider, what is power when stripped of harmony? What is empire when the river no longer flows? Even in ruin, the Akkadian language endured. For centuries after Akkad's fall, scribes copied the curse of Akkad on clay tablets, teaching students its lesson, that kingship without humility invites silence from the heavens. And perhaps that is why the tale still lingers today. It is more than a myth, it is the first great lament of civilization itself. The first whisper that progress and hubris may walk hand in hand, and that even the brightest empires cast shadows behind their light. We can almost imagine it, the final twilight of Agade. The sun setting over empty courtyards. A single tablet, freshly inscribed, drying in the heat. Somewhere, a scribe pauses his stylus and looks toward the horizon, where dust blurs the distant mountains. He knows the story he has written is not merely about gods and kings. It is about the fragility of all that humans build, and the quiet dignity in remembering. In that silence, the empire fades, not defeated by armies, but dissolved by time, by drought, by the patient erosion of history itself. And yet, in that fading, something beautiful remains. The words, the art, the memory of a people who dreamed the first dream of empire, and who left behind not only power, but wisdom. As the king faded into legend, so too did his empire, undone not by sword, but by time. When stars became stories, humanity began to understand the divine. In the soft dawn of Mesopotamia, long before the empires of iron or marble, people looked upward, toward the quiet glitter of the stars, and saw not distance, but presence. For the Akkadians, as for the Sumerians before them, faith was not an abstraction. It was the living fabric of the world. The Akkadian pantheon was vast and layered, a merging of northern Semitic traditions with the ancient Sumerian gods of the south. It was a union not of conquest, but of translation, a harmony of names and meanings. The goddess Inanna of Uruk became Ishtar, radiant and fierce, the sky-father, and remained above all, distant and eternal. Enlil, god of air and order, ruled the fates of kings and crops. Shamash, the sun god, carried justice across the sky each day. And beneath the earth, Ereshkigal kept silent watch over the realm of the dead. Every household, from palace to humble hut, lived within this divine hierarchy. Worship was not confined to temples. It flowed through daily life. Farmers poured water to the ground before planting, invoking Enki, god of wisdom and rivers, to bless their fields. Merchants whispered prayers to Ishtar before long journeys. Mothers and midwives invoked Gula, the goddess of healing, during childbirth. In the Akkadian world, every act had a spiritual reflection, every breath, a rhythm in the larger music of existence. Clay tablets from Nippur and Sippar reveal prayers written in both Sumerian and Akkadian, the two tongues intertwined like the people themselves. Their bilingual hymns show that belief was not a static inheritance but a conversation, renewed with each generation. The great temples, or ziggurats, were more than places of worship. They were cosmic ladders, built from baked brick and devotion. Each level represented a bridge between the human and the divine. Priests tended them not with grandeur, but with ritual patience, sweeping floors, lighting lamps, reciting hymns in measured tones. Their work was the quiet maintenance of balance, ensuring that the gods, pleased by care, would keep the rivers flowing and the winds gentle. Inside these temples, time seemed to move differently. The world outside, of harvests and markets and politics, softened into the hum of incense and the flicker of sacred flame. To enter a shrine was to step into eternity, where the gods were not imagined but present. For the Akkadians, faith was order. It explained the shape of the cosmos, the justice of kings, the birth and decay of cities. It gave reason to the unpredictable, the flood, the famine, the drought, transforming chaos into meaning. When rain did not come, it was not simply absence. It was a message. When the Tigris overflowed, it was not misfortune. It was a reminder of divine power. The integration of the Sumerian and Akkadian pantheons was a profound act of unity, cultural, spiritual, and linguistic. It symbolized the empire itself. Many voices joined under one celestial order. The gods were not replaced, but shared. Ishtar could be both the lover and the warrior, both Inanna of Uruk and the queen of heaven of Akkad. The divine, like the empire, expanded through understanding rather than erasure. In one hymn to Ishtar, copied centuries after the Akkadian age, her power is described as the storm that brings life. The line carries a subtle paradox, destruction and creation as one act, much like the rise and fall of empires. Worship also shaped morality. The Akkadians believed that justice flowed from Shamash, truth from Enlil, compassion from Ishtar. To live rightly was not only to obey law but to remain in harmony with these divine principles. A good life was measured not by wealth or conquest, but by one's ability to uphold me, the sacred order that bound heaven and earth. In the calm of evening, one can imagine the priests of Agade ascending the temple steps, clay lamps in hand, their chants rising into the dusk. The scent of cedar smoke fills the air. The hymns echo through the courtyards, weaving together language, music, and belief. For a moment, all feels aligned. The stars above, the city below, and the silent gods between them. Even as the Akkadian Empire later crumbled, its gods endured. For nearly 2,000 years afterward, their names continued to appear in prayers, seals, and stories. Their myths carried onward by Babylonian and Assyrian scribes. Through faith, the Akkadians achieved a kind of immortality. To understand their pantheon is to understand their humanity. Their longing for connection, their reverence for order, their quiet awe before the mysteries of nature. Faith, for them, was not escape from the world. It was a way of belonging to it completely. In temples and hymns, faith found its rhythm, echoed in the daily lives of those who served. How does devotion sound? In the quiet before dawn, before the sun rose above the plains of Akkad, before markets stirred or wheels turned upon the dust, the first sounds of the city came not from its streets, but from its temples. A soft rhythm of footsteps, the crackle of oil lamps being lit, the low murmur of sacred words. To the Akkadians, the temple was not merely a building. It was the axis of the world, the meeting point of heaven, earth, and the underworld. Each city had its own, dedicated to a patron deity. Ishtar in Agade, Enlil in Nippur, Shamash in Sippar. Their ziggurats rose like stairways of clay, lifting human devotion toward the invisible realm above. In the first pale light of morning, priests and priestesses began their duties. They washed, anointed themselves with oils, and approached the inner sanctum in silence. Every motion was deliberate, every breath part of an ancient choreography. The act of opening a temple door was not simple maintenance. It was the awakening of the divine presence for the new day. Archaeological tablets describe the order of daily rites. Washing the statue of the god, dressing it in fine fabrics, adorning it with gold and lapis. The deity was treated not as symbol, but as resident. To neglect the image was to neglect the god itself. As incense burned, its scent filled the chambers, cedar, myrrh, and juniper rising like a soft offering to the heavens. The fragrance carried prayers upward, believed to bridge the distance between mortal breath and divine ear. Then came music, flutes carved from reeds, the steady pulse of small drums, and voices chanting hymns in both Sumerian and Akkadian. Their rhythm was slow and circular, meant not to excite but to align. The melodies followed the cycles of nature, sunrise, flood, harvest, echoing the order of the cosmos. If one could stand within those walls and listen, devotion would not sound like command or plea. It would sound like breathing, steady, patterned, eternal. The ritual calendar marked every turn of the year. Festivals celebrated the marriage of gods, the renewal of kingship, the first fruits of the fields. Yet even the grandest rites began in stillness, in the quiet moment when a priest touched water to his lips, or when the temple gate creaked open to greet the dawn. Each offering bread, beer, honey, or perfume was symbolic of the human world sustaining the divine. The gods were not distant masters, but partners in existence. Humans tended to them, and in return, the gods maintained balance in nature and society. Inscriptions from Naram-Sin's reign mention temple restorations across Akkad, an empire of sanctuaries linked by shared ceremony. Each ritual, no matter how small, echoed the rhythm of the larger world. The high priestess, often of royal blood, embodied this sacred bridge. Known as the Entu, she performed songs to the moon god Nana and the love goddess Inanna. Her role was both political and spiritual, ensuring harmony between city and cosmos. The sound of her chant, carried over courtyards at night, was thought to protect the people while they slept. Inside, the flicker of lamps reflected off bronze bowls and clay tablets inscribed with hymns. Outside, the city began to stir. Smoke from hearths mingled with temple incense. The sacred and the ordinary intertwined. Ritual was not spectacle. It was maintenance of faith, of memory, of the delicate balance between man and God. Every sweeping of the floor, every offering of water, every syllable of chant contributed to the cosmic rhythm that held the empire together. Even centuries later, Babylonian priests preserved these Akkadian hymns nearly word for word. Through sound and repetition, the ancient language of devotion never truly vanished. To worship in Akkad was to participate in creation itself. Ritual mirrored the heavens' order, repetition, renewal. Just as the stars followed their paths, so too did the hands of the priest, the voice of the singer, the steps of the celebrant. Through this harmony, humanity believed it could sustain the heartbeat of the universe. And as night descended, the temple quieted once more. The gods, satisfied, returned to their unseen chambers. The lamps dimmed. The city exhaled. The rhythm paused, only to begin again with the first light of dawn. Outside temple walls, another faith thrived. The everyday faith of labor, family, and survival. Perhaps empires endure not in stone, but in prayer. Across the breadth of Akkad, from the rivers of Sumer to the mountains of the north, there ran a thread unseen yet unbroken, faith. Not a single creed, but a living weave of devotion, myth, and duty. Where soldiers marched and traders passed, temples and shrines followed, and with them, a shared language of reverence. The empire's faith was its most enduring architecture. Armies could seize walls, but only belief could bind the hearts behind them. From the smallest village altar to the towering ziggurats of Agade, a quiet order held. The gods watched and humanity, in return, remembered them. At the center stood the king, no longer just ruler but chosen intermediary. Since Sargon's time, kingship itself was declared divine in origin, descended from the heavens. Under Naram-Sin, that divinity deepened. His crown bore horns once reserved for gods, a symbol that power flowed not merely through conquest, but through sacred purpose. To serve him was to serve the god's design, to rebel and act against cosmic order itself. In Akkadian hymns preserved on clay, scribes wrote of the king as shepherd of the gods' people. Even the word for ruler, saram, carried connotations of care and balance. Leadership, at least in theory, was not domination but stewardship, a sacred responsibility to maintain harmony between heaven and earth. Religion gave coherence to diversity. The empire stretched across lands of many tongues and traditions, yet its people shared ritual vocabulary. The lighting of lamps, the pouring of water, the offering of bread. Each act echoed across distance, a unifying rhythm that transcended dialect and border. Priests and scribes acted as the empire's quiet messengers, carrying not commands, but calendars, marking feast days, sacrifices, and omens. In a world of clay tablets and sealed archives, faith was the courier that never ceased its rounds. Through shared hymns, unity became audible. The same melodies sung in Ur echoed in Akkad. The same invocations rose from the coasts of the Persian Gulf to the fertile plains of Assyria. In song, the empire remembered itself. The hymn to Ishtar of the morning appears in both Sumerian and Akkadian versions, the first known bilingual liturgy. It represents more than translation. It marks the merging of civilizations into a single cultural consciousness. Through worship, language itself became empire. Even morality was framed through divine expectation. The gods, it was believed, favored truth, fairness, and moderation. A scribe who cheated his measure, a merchant who lied in trade, a ruler who ignored justice. Each risked not only human punishment, but cosmic imbalance. The temple's shadow thus extended into the marketplace, into law, into daily life. And so, as the empire matured, religion became its gentle lawgiver. Where governors enforced order with seal and soldier, faith inspired obedience through meaning. It whispered that every life, from servant to king, carried purpose in the great design. At festivals, when the sacred statues left their shrines and paraded through the streets, people saw not symbols, but presence. Children bowed, merchants paused, elders whispered blessings. These moments reminded all, Akkadian, Sumerian, or foreign, that they were part of something vast and eternal. Centuries later, when the empire's cities had fallen silent, these same hymns and prayers were still copied by Babylonian scribes. The empire's clay had crumbled, but its voice endured, a testament to belief's quiet permanence. Faith, more than force, held Akkad together. It crossed rivers that armies could not, softened hearts that laws could not reach. It gave shape to power and grace to its exercise. In a land often torn by flood and drought, it offered stability, the comfort that even amid ruin, the gods still listened. In the end, what made Akkad more than a kingdom was not its walls or weapons, but its sense of cosmic belonging. The people of the empire, from priest to plowman, shared the same sky, the same prayers, the same hope that divine order would guide their days. As torches dimmed in the temples and stars emerged above the plains, those prayers continued, whispered by lips unknown, rising softly into the night. Yet even the strongest thread may fray, and the empire's daily life now reveals both brilliance and strain. How did ordinary hands sustain an empire of dreams? The empire's grandeur, its palaces, temples, and armies, was not born of kings alone. It was sustained by the rhythm of daily life, by the countless hands that shaped earth, water, and clay. In the soft dawns of Mesopotamia, before the markets awoke and the scribes unrolled their tablets, the empire stirred quietly, in fields glistening with dew, and in courtyards still cool from the night's breeze. To the farmers of Akkad, the day began with the rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates were lifelines, unpredictable yet generous. Through a lattice of canals and ditches, water was guided, measured, and prayed over. The irrigation systems were not mere engineering, but acts of faith, offerings of balance between nature and will. Each channel told a story of cooperation, neighbors working together under the supervision of temple officials, ensuring the flow of life itself. Ancient tablets from the Akkadian period list detailed water quotas, assigned to each plot of land. Even then, there was awareness of fairness, an understanding that the empire's strength depended on shared abundance, not hoarded wealth. When the fields were fed, so too were the markets. The city was a living organism, breathing through trade and craft. In the shaded lanes of Agade or Nippur, potters turned their wheels, metalworkers hammered copper and silver, and weavers sang quietly as they worked the looms. Each craft carried a lineage, taught by hand, remembered by heart. The markets themselves were orchestras of sound. The murmur of merchants, the ring of weights on scales, the bleating of animals, the soft barter of grain for oil, wool for lapis lazuli. Yet within the hum there was peace. These were not voices of chaos, but of community, a collective rhythm that kept the empire alive. Children learned early to observe this order. They watched their elders inscribe marks on clay, learning to count measures and trace words. Education was a privilege, yet also a duty, the act of recording life for those who would come after. The scribes, seated cross-legged in courtyards or temple schools, were among the quiet architects of civilization. Their tablets spoke for fields and families, for debts repaid, for prayers offered. Among the thousands of clay tablets discovered, not all tell of kings or wars. Many are humble notes, lists of tools, records of bread rations, letters between relatives. Through them, the ancient world breathes. A father writing to his son, a merchant sending greetings to his partner in another city. Festivals brought brief reprieve from labor. When the sun dipped low and drums began to echo, people gathered in temple plazas. Offerings of fruit, wine, and incense were laid before the gods. Dancers moved in slow circles, and singers raised hymns that drifted into the night. These celebrations were not escape, but renewal, reminders that human toil was part of a greater pattern. The seasons marked time not just by harvests, but by emotion, the steady balance of gratitude and endurance. Life in Akkad was fragile, always at the mercy of flood or drought, yet its people learned to find peace in repetition. Each planting and reaping was a dialogue between the seen and unseen, between effort and faith. Within the city walls, community was the truest currency. Neighbors shared bread, tools, and news. Women oversaw households, brewed beer, and tended gardens that softened the brick courtyards. The scent of barley, clay, and smoke mingled with laughter. Despite empire and decree, life's essence remained simple, a shared understanding that peace was built one day at a time. Excavations at Telbrak and Eshnunna reveal small clay tokens shaped like animals and tools, perhaps children's toys, perhaps offerings. Either way, they speak of tenderness, of a civilization that, even amid expansion, did not forget the quiet beauty of its smallest moments. As dusk fell, the city returned to silence. The canals reflected fading light. The last traders closed their stalls. Families gathered near oil lamps, telling stories that reached back to the gods and heroes of old. The empire might stretch across mountains and deserts, but its heart remained here, in the calm constancy of human life, where work, worship, and wonder intertwined. For the people of Akkad, greatness was not always grand. It lived in the daily act of tending the earth, shaping clay, and raising children who would speak the language of their ancestors. Beneath every monument lay the imprint of countless ordinary hands, anonymous, enduring, and sacred in their simplicity. Beyond work and harvest, language itself became Akkad's greatest monument. When a language learns to write, memory no longer sleeps. Long before empires rose and fell, before kings claimed divinity or scribes inked their tablets, there was sound, the music of language. Out of that sound, the Akkadians built their world. Their speech, once carried only by wind and story, began to take shape in clay. It was here, between reed and tablet, that thought found permanence. In the beginning, Sumerian ruled the written word. It was the script of temples, trade, and the gods. The Akkadians, Semitic-speaking neighbors to the north, learned it as one learns a sacred tongue. Yet as their influence grew, they began to bend the ancient symbols toward their own sounds, teaching the old script to sing in a new rhythm. Cuneiform, once purely Sumerian, became Akkadian, a living record of transformation. The wedge-shaped impressions, pressed gently into wet clay, evolved from ritual notation to an instrument of empire. Through them, the language of Akkad became not only spoken, but immortal. Many of the earliest bilingual tablets show the transition. A line in Sumerian, a line beneath it in Akkadian. These are not just translations. They are moments of cultural fusion, where an empire learns to express itself without erasing its roots. In the archives of cities like Ebla, Mari, and Nippur, thousands of such tablets have survived, letters, decrees, poems, and contracts. Their words travel across 4,000 years, unbroken by time. Through them we hear voices once hushed. A governor reporting grain shortages, a merchant seeking safe passage, a priest recording the names of the stars. The Akkadian script carried a quiet revolution. No longer confined to one region or priesthood, writing became a shared tool of administration and memory. The scribes of Akkad, trained in the temple schools, recorded not only divine hymns but inventories, maps, and even proverbs, reflections of a people thinking about themselves. Language was more than record. It was identity. Each sign etched into clay reminded the empire of its unity, from the mountain fringes of Elam to the delta cities of Sumer. To write in Akkadian was to belong to its world, to share its rhythm and thought. And within those words, a subtle poetry emerged. Even bureaucratic tablets, when read aloud, pulse with the cadence of breath, a reminder that writing was once voice. A single tablet might begin with invocations of peace or blessings to the gods before descending into lists of rations or shipments. Even in duty there was reverence. One letter from an Akkadian scribe to his superior ends not with command, but with a wish. May the gods keep you in health and grant calm days. It is the oldest known written benediction, proof that language, even when administrative, can be tender. Cuneiform's beauty lay not in symmetry, but in depth. Each mark was a conversation between hand, tool, and meaning, a patient act repeated thousands of times across generations. Clay, so ordinary, became the empire's archive of thought. In its grooves rested law, art, prayer, and love. The Akkadians also gave us one of humanity's earliest literary masterpieces, the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in Akkadian form. Though its roots were older, the Akkadian version carried emotional resonance that feels timeless. The quest for friendship, loss, and immortality. Its survival proves that even empires, built on stone and bronze, endure longest through words. To the Akkadians, language was sacred matter, both tool and offering. Words shaped creation in myth, defined law in governance, and preserved memory beyond life. Through language, they believed the divine could be approached, and the mortal made eternal. In one hymn to the goddess Nisaba, patroness of writing, a scribe addresses his stylus. O reed that speaks wisdom, may your tip never dull. It is a small prayer, a wish that thought itself remain sharp, alive, and capable of remembrance. Across centuries, while empires fell to dust, the Akkadian tongue lingered, taught, copied, reinterpreted. Babylonian and Assyrian scholars would later inherit it, reshaping it into their own dialects, yet always aware of its lineage. Through them, Akkad's words continued to whisper. In libraries, in prayers, in prophecy. The Akkadian Empire may have passed, but its language became a monument without walls. In the soft light of lamplight or the sun's fading glow, scribes pressed knowledge into earth, leaving behind not ruins, but voices. Even now, when archaeologists brush dust from a tablet long buried, the silence breaks once more. The empire speaks again, not through conquest or decree, but through the gentle permanence of the written word. From language to art, the Akkadians painted their world in clay and song. Stories are the dreams of civilizations, whispered across millennia. Long before parchment and paper, stories slept in clay. They were pressed into tablets, one careful mark at a time. Thoughts that would outlive the breath that spoke them. The Akkadians, inheriting the songs of Sumer, turned these ancient murmurs into something enduring, literature. Their words carried not only history, but emotion, a bridge between memory and comfort, between the known and the divine. When the first Akkadian scribes began to write down stories, they were doing something quietly revolutionary. They weren't only recording events. They were preserving feelings: awe, grief, courage, longing. Through their hymns and epics, the Akkadians began to understand themselves. Their literature grew from two roots: Sumerian myth and Akkadian voice. Sumerian tales had already sung of gods and heroes, but the Akkadians gave these stories new resonance. They added reflection, rhythm, and human fragility. 1. The epic voice. Among the earliest and most beautiful of these works stands the Epic of Gilgamesh. Though it began in Sumer, it was in Akkadian that the story found its eternal form. The Akkadian poets gave the hero a soul, a restless king who learns that all strength must one day yield to time. In the soft recitation of this poem, listeners could hear both triumph and sorrow. The clatter of city gates, the silence of death, the river's endless flow. Through Gilgamesh's search for immortality, the Akkadians discovered something deeper: that meaning lives not in eternity, but in remembrance. To those who listened in temple courtyards or by the low flame of evening lamps, the story was both lesson and lullaby, a reminder that no life, no matter how mighty, escapes the stillness of the stars. 2. Hymns and prayers. Beyond the epics were hymns, written in devotion to gods like Ishtar, Shamash, and Enlil. These were not cold recitations. They were songs of yearning, gratitude, and order. A hymn to Ishtar might begin with thunder and end with tenderness, describing her as both the morning star and the evening's peace. A prayer to Shamash, the sun god, often began at dawn. You rise, O light of heaven, judge of truth. May your rays see all that is hidden. Through such verses, the people of Akkad wove their faith into daily rhythm. These hymns were sung during offerings, festivals, and harvests, blending sound, incense, and devotion into one sensory calm. To listen to an Akkadian hymn was to feel time slow. Each syllable carried the weight of belief, and each pause honored silence itself. 3. Proverbs and reflections. Not all Akkadian writing was divine or heroic. Some of it was simply wise, the gentle counsel of experience. Clay tablets from schools and homes reveal lists of proverbs, written by scribes in training, yet meant for anyone who sought peace in words. He who sows peace harvests joy. A kind word is stronger than a wall. The flood forgets the stone that stood firm. Each saying is small, almost whisper-like, but together they form a moral map of the Akkadian world, a guide for conduct, patience, and humility. Such proverbs remind us that ancient literature was not distant or grand. It was human, the same quiet wisdom one might seek before sleep, when the world turns inward. For the scribe as storyteller, every story needed a guardian. The scribes of Akkad were not mere record-keepers, they were curators of imagination. In temple schools, they copied hymns and myths by hand, learning the rhythm of each line. Over years, their styluses grew smoother, their tablets more graceful. A good scribe did more than preserve, they interpreted. When they rewrote an old Sumerian tale in Akkadian, they added breath where there had been silence, emotion where there had been formality. Each retelling was an act of love, a reaffirmation that the story mattered. One tablet, found broken in the sands near Mari, ends mid-sentence. Yet even in its incompleteness, it whispers something profound, that stories, like empires, are never finished. They only pause, waiting to be retold. 5. The comfort of story in the quiet of night. When labor ceased and the desert cooled, the Akkadians told their tales aloud. Some recounted the adventures of gods. Others shared moral parables or gentle humor. Storytelling became a ritual of rest, a way to make sense of a vast, unpredictable world. To speak of heroes and gods was to remember that humans, too, could endure, love, and hope. These tales lulled listeners into a thoughtful calm, much like the hum of the stars overhead. The act of listening itself became sacred, an exchange of peace between the living and the remembered. Through their literature, the Akkadians left more than relics of belief. They left the pattern of human thought, reflective, yearning, endlessly creative. Each hymn, epic, and proverb was a candle against oblivion. And though the language has faded from the tongue, its stories still breathe. They echo whenever we wonder who we are, why we love, and what remains after we are gone. But as the stories spread, the empire stretched thin, reaching beyond its own horizon. What lies beyond the edge of every empire's map? The western horizon shimmered, not with gold or promise, but with distance. Beyond the Euphrates, the lands unfolded like an ancient dream. Mountains veiled in mist, forests murmuring with unknown tongues, and seas whose waves touched worlds Akkad had only imagined. Under banners of bronze and certainty, Akkad marched westward. Yet these were not the furious conquests of Sargon's youth. They were journeys of connection, threads of trade, tribute, and quiet diplomacy. From the Levant to Anatolia, emissaries carried Akkadian language and custom, while merchants followed with copper, lapis, and fine-grained cedar. The world was widening, and with it, the empire's reflection. 1. The river and the road. Every march began with water. The Euphrates, ancient and patient, was both a guide and a mirror, flowing west toward lands that whispered of change. Barges carried envoys along its bends. Soldiers followed its banks. As the river thinned into tributaries, Akkadian scouts marked new cities, Ebla, Mari, Byblos, each with its own gods, its own order of life. To approach these cities was not to conquer them by sword, but by presence. The Akkadians understood that sometimes the gentlest form of power was simply to arrive, to be seen, to be known. The clay tablets of Mari later spoke of this contact. Letters written in Akkadian, exchanged between kings who had never met but spoke the same written word. In that shared language lay a quiet triumph, diplomacy carved in clay rather than won in battle. 2. The breath of distant lands westward. The air changed. It smelled of pine and salt, carrying stories of coastal traders who sailed under the moon. To the Akkadians, these lands seemed less like enemies and more like echoes, distant reflections of themselves. They found art carved in stone, songs sung to gods with different names but familiar hearts. The merchants of Ebla offered perfumes and silver. The kings of the Levant sent gifts of timber and wine. In return, Akkad sent what it valued most: its symbols, its scribes, its memory. Trade routes became arteries of understanding. Along them, Akkadian became the language of exchange, spreading far beyond its birthplace. Even centuries later, long after the empire's fall, its words still lingered on the lips of traders and scribes, proof that empire can outlive itself through communication alone. 3. The diplomats and the dreamers. The Akkadians were not only soldiers and builders. They were dreamers with scrolls instead of swords. In the courts of foreign kings, they spoke softly of unity and order, of how the world might be harmonized through shared law and writing. Their diplomacy was patient, almost ceremonial. Letters began with blessings to the gods of both lands, a mutual recognition that even beneath differing skies, reverence was the same. These exchanges revealed something profound. Akkad no longer sought to rule by conquest, but by idea. An idea that culture could cross borders more gently than armies could. For those who slept beneath Akkad's peace, the empire was not tyranny. It was rhythm. Trade at dawn, scribes at midday, hymns at dusk. For the quiet edges of power yet, even as peace and trade flourished, faint tremors stirred beneath the empire's reach. To stretch is to strain, and Akkad, now vast and luminous, began to feel its own distance. Governors at the frontiers, days away from the capital, grew more autonomous. Messages sent by courier took weeks to arrive, and the tone of obedience softened into interpretation. At the fringes, local rulers smiled at Akkad's envoys while quietly strengthening their own courts. Tribute came slower, loyalty slower still. And yet, in the stillness of night, campfires flickered beside foreign rivers, where Akkadian soldiers spoke softly of home, of Sargon's city, of temples and family, of stars that looked the same everywhere. In those moments, the empire felt whole again. 5. The weight of distance expansion, even peaceful, carries a cost unseen. The farther the empire extended, the thinner its voice became. Orders faded as they crossed mountains. In cities like Ebla and Ugarit, Akkadian envoys reported both wonder and unease, distant allies who smiled but whispered of freedom. But for a time the balance held. The Akkadians moved as both guests and guardians, tracing the outer edges of civilization's dawn. They built no great monuments there, only relationships, sealed in trade and trust. In the quiet halls of those faraway courts, the name of Akkad was spoken with respect, sometimes fear, and always curiosity. And somewhere along those endless roads, a truth began to take shape, that empire is not measured by conquest alone, but by the reach of understanding. The Euphrates still flowed, returning each current homeward. Yet, as the empire followed its waters outward, something fragile within it began to drift. The center could no longer feel every heartbeat at its edges. And the story of Akkad, once a single song, began to echo in many voices. But as borders expanded, unity began to fade. Empires do not fall in battles, they tire. East of Akkad, beyond the slow turn of the Tigris, the land began to rise, from river plains to rugged hills, and then to the high valleys of Elam. For centuries, the Elamites had watched Mesopotamia's empires rise and fade like the seasons. They traded, warred, and intermarried with Sumer and Akkad alike. To them, Akkad was both neighbor and shadow, a power that offered order, but also demanded obedience. At first, the relationship was practical. Akkadian merchants brought silver and wool. Elamite traders returned with copper and stone. Between their cities, Susa, Anshan, and the far valleys beyond, commerce became conversation, cautious but constant. Yet beneath every trade agreement lay an ancient tension, the uneasy peace of equals who remembered when they were rivals. 1. The whisper of the hills. The Elamites lived closer to the mountains than the rivers, and the mountains made them patient. While the Akkadians built roads and temples, Elam's people honed the slower arts of survival, waiting, observing, enduring. Their lands were rich in metals, their warriors hardened by terrain. To Akkad, these lands seemed both essential and elusive. Control of Elam's routes meant control of eastern trade. Tin from the highlands, stones from beyond the Zagros, lifeblood for the empire's bronze and ornament. So Sargon and later his descendants sought to secure them, not always with war, but with presence. Garrisons along the borders, governors installed near Susa, treaties inked on clay. For a time it worked. Tribute flowed westward. Akkadian names appeared in Elamite records. The empire's influence stretched deep into the valleys. But power is never one-sided for long. 2. The echo of resistance. When Sargon's sons inherited the crown, the Elamites tested their patience. They rebelled not in grand campaigns, but in whispers and withdrawals, refusing tribute here, striking at a garrison there. To Rimish and Manishtushu, these were not wars of glory, but of attrition, battles fought against the very concept of distance. Each campaign eastward drained time and trust. Victories were won, but never truly kept. In clay inscriptions, Akkadian scribes recorded triumphs. Elam was subdued. Its kings bowed before Akkad. Yet archaeology tells a quieter truth. The same cities were conquered, lost, and conquered again. A rhythm of struggle that outlasted the kings themselves. This was not the fall of an empire, but the slow pulse of exhaustion. For every victory, another frontier stirred. The long shadow of Susa, Elam's ancient heart, stood as both prize and warning. When it fell under Akkadian control, it became more than a conquered city. It was a bridge between two worlds. Akkadian administrators arrived with tablets, seals, and scribes, bringing the order of empire. Yet, they also absorbed the local ways, Elamite dialects, traditions, and artistry. Clay archives found in later centuries revealed a remarkable synthesis. Contracts written half in Akkadian, half in Elamite, names of officials blending both tongues. Even in domination, there was exchange, an acknowledgement that the two lands could not remain strangers. But Susa also remembered. Long after Akkad's power dimmed, it would rise again under Elamite kings, reclaiming the legacy of both oppressor and ally. Empires may fade, but borderlands remember every footprint. For the weariness of kings by the time of Naram-Sin, the empire's eastern campaigns no longer burned with conquest, they smoldered. The king who had once stood as a god on mountains now faced resistance from lands that refused to yield. Each victory cost more than the one before. More men, more grain, more time. It was not defeat that loomed, but fatigue, the slow erosion of certainty. For an empire stretched across deserts, mountains, and seas, even silence could feel like defiance. And yet, in the calm retelling of history, we see something deeply human in that weariness. Empires, like people, have limits. They reach outward until they meet their own reflection, and realize that not all lands are meant to be possessed. 5. Calm discovery archaeologists, centuries later, found Akkadian tablets buried in Elamite soil, small, sun-baked witnesses to coexistence. Some bore lists of rations for soldiers. Others recorded prayers for peace. In those fragile marks of reed and clay, a quiet truth survives. Even amid rivalry, understanding endures. The Elamite challenge was never merely war. It was the test of whether Akkad's vision could survive contact with a world just as ancient, just as proud. And though the empire's banners would one day fall, its words, its measures, and its myths would continue eastward, carried by those it once sought to rule. And Akkad, though weary, still stood, its heart vast but slowing. Exhaustion, not enemies, would soon prove the empire's undoing. When the rivers forget to flow, even gods grow silent. Long before Akkad's final days, the sky had already begun to change. It started subtly. Summers that lingered too long, winds that carried more dust than rain. The Tigris and Euphrates, once generous veins of civilization, shrank within their banks. Fields that once shimmered with barley dulled to pale earth. For centuries, the rivers had been givers of life, teaching humanity the rhythm of flood and renewal. But around 2200 BCE, that rhythm faltered. Across the Fertile Crescent, weather patterns shifted, rains withdrew, storms scattered elsewhere. The world grew quieter, as if the breath of the land itself had slowed. 1. The drying of the plain. Archaeologists speak of this time as the 4.2 kilo-year event, a global drought that darkened kingdoms from Egypt to the Indus. For the Akkadians, whose empire depended on irrigation and harvest, the change was not a single catastrophe, but a slow tightening. Villages along the northern plains emptied first. Farmers, unable to coax grain from salt-stiffened soil, migrated southward toward the rivers. But even there, the water was no longer enough. Canals silted. Reservoirs cracked. The once steady pulse of agriculture began to falter. In the texts that survive, the tone shifts. Prayers grow more desperate. Offerings increase. The gods, once thanked for abundance, are now pleaded with for mercy. One hymn laments, "The fields gave no grain, the rivers no fish, the heavens withheld their dew." Whether myth or memory, it captures the sound of an empire listening for rain that never came. 2. Hunger and the human tide. As harvests failed, hunger followed, not in sudden famine, but in waves of scarcity that reshaped lives. Caravans that once carried luxury goods now bore refugees. Merchants became wanderers. Scribes traded tablets for bread. In the north, the Akkadians, mountain tribes who had long dwelled beyond the empire's edge, descended toward Akkad's weakening frontiers. To them, the cities seemed rich and ripe. To the Akkadians, they seemed unstoppable. Not armies, but inevitabilities. But perhaps the true invader was not man, but climate, invisible, patient, absolute. For what wall can stand against a sky that refuses to rain? Still, in the calm retelling of history, there is no blame, only cause and consequence. The empire that had united rivers, tongues, and gods could not unite against the wind. 3. The abandonment of cities. Archaeological strata from this time tell a silent story. Beneath layers of dust lie empty streets, unfinished walls, pottery left mid-use. as if people rose one morning and simply walked away. In the northern city of Tel Leilon, evidence shows abrupt abandonment. Storage rooms sealed, grain jars half-filled, hearths cold. It is a haunting image, not destruction by war, but surrender to drought. Further south, near the heartland of Akkad, salinization made the fields bitter. Once fertile soils turned white, shimmering under the relentless sun. A people who had mastered water now faced the truth that mastery is never ownership, only borrowing. For calm discoveries, modern scientists have traced the story through ancient dust, cores of soil and pollen revealing centuries of parched silence. Each layer a sentence in the earth's slow language, confirming what the scribes once whispered. The land forgot to live, yet even here, there is a strange peace. For within decline lies remembrance, proof that the Akkadians had built something vast enough to leave behind echoes measurable thousands of years later. The drought was their undoing, but also their immortality. Because through their struggle, we glimpse not just a fallen empire, but humanity's enduring pattern. The rise, the reach, and the quiet return to dust. And so, as the rivers dwindled and the gods grew silent, Akkad began to unweave itself, not with a clash of swords, but with the stillness of a land remembering what it once was, earth, sky, and silence. And so began the empire's final chapter, the slow unweaving of its golden thread. Every empire has a dusk, gentle, inevitable, and strangely peaceful. There are moments in history when endings arrive not as storms, but as seasons, quiet, gradual, and certain. For the Akkadian Empire, that season was heralded not by prophecy, but by footsteps descending from the northern hills, the Akkadians, wanderers of the mountains. They were a people of wind and stone, born to the highlands that overlooked Mesopotamia. For generations, they had lived where rivers ran thin, their lives bound to herds and sky. When the plains below began to empty, when drought and hunger turned fields to dust, the Akkadians came down not as conquerors at first, but as survivors seeking sustenance. To the Akkadians, they seemed endless, appearing from the passes in small bands, moving like shadows across a weary land. 1. The quiet invasion. The word invasion often conjures fury, banners, the crash of cities. But the Akkadians' coming was slower, a migration that became a takeover, wave upon quiet wave. Each village they entered was already half abandoned. Each town they claimed, already hollowed by hunger. They took what remained, livestock, grain, homes, not in hatred, but in necessity. And in that necessity an empire unraveled. The Akkadian garrisons, once firm outposts of order, found themselves isolated. Messengers stopped coming. Canals fell silent. The network that had tied 1,000 miles of land into one heartbeat broke apart into a scatter of pulses, each fading at its own pace. In the stillness that followed, the cities of Akkad, those monuments of empire, became refuges for the wind. 2. The memory of kings. The chronicles of later kings remember the Akkadians not kindly. They are called people who knew no kingship, men who destroyed temples, those who brought no offerings. But history, softened by time, reminds us that such words often come from the defeated. Perhaps the Akkadians did not destroy out of malice. Perhaps they simply did not know how to sustain the fragile machinery of empire, the irrigation, the record-keeping, the delicate balance between faith and food. Theirs was a simpler rhythm, one closer to the earth than to the throne. And so, what the Akkadians had built, the first great experiment in centralized rule, dissolved not in flames but in neglect. Fields lay fallow, temples crumbled, archives turned to clay once more. To later generations it seemed as though the gods themselves had abandoned Akkad. But perhaps it was not divine wrath, only nature reclaiming what humans had stretched too far. 3. The city of Akkad in silence of the capital itself. Agade, heart of empire, history offers almost nothing. No walls, no ruins, no monuments remain. Somewhere beneath layers of soil and centuries, the city sleeps, its streets turn to dust. Yet in the poetic fragments that endure, its memory still flickers. One lament reads, "Its people were carried away like grasshoppers before the wind." The line is mournful but not bitter, as if accepting that all things built must one day return to earth. The Akkadians likely wandered through those empty streets unaware of what they had inherited, unaware that they walked through the heart of what had once been humanity's first empire. For calm discoveries, modern archaeologists, tracing the footprints of this twilight age, find not carnage, but quiet. No vast fields of destruction, no burnt palaces. Only gradual abandonment, the marks of life receding rather than exploding. Akkad did not fall in a single moment. It exhaled, releasing centuries of ambition into the air, letting the rivers and sands erase the boundaries it once drew. And yet, even in that fading there was continuity. The Akkadians adopted fragments of Akkadian culture, the cuneiform script, the language, the gods whose names they learned to pronounce. Through them, the empire's spirit drifted onward, invisible yet enduring. In the soft twilight of decline, renewal began, new rulers rising, new languages taking shape, the soil slowly healing beneath the sun. The Akkadian invasion, then, was not the world ending, it was the world turning. The rivers, in time, would flow again. The gods would speak through new voices, and from Akkad's memory would spring the seeds of future empires. Babylon, Assyria, countless others tracing the same eternal pattern. Rise, reach, rest. Every dusk, however long, is only the promise of another dawn. Yet not all fell to the sword. Some simply faded into the dust. What does it mean for a city to vanish, yet never die? There are names in history that shimmer like mirages, bright, eternal, yet untouchable. Akkad is one of them. Once the heartbeat of the world's first empire, its walls rang with hymns to kings and gods. Its streets glimmered with the dust of conquest and trade. Yet today, not a single stone has been found. No temple, no palace, no road remains to mark its place upon the earth. The city that ruled a continent simply disappeared. 1. The vanishing point for centuries. Scholars have searched the plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, combing the soil for a trace of the capital of Sargon the Great. They found other cities, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, each whispering fragments of the story. But Akkad itself remains silent. Perhaps the river swallowed it, perhaps the desert buried it, or perhaps time, that slow, patient sculptor, erased it grain by grain until nothing was left but its name. It is a strange fate for the city that once called itself the navel of the world. The more we search, the further it seems to recede, not into the earth, but into the realm of memory and myth, where all great things eventually go. 2. Memory as monument without walls to measure, without ruins to map. Akkad exists only through words. Cuneiform tablets from distant cities mention its splendor, its temples rising like mountains, its wealth surpassing all others. But these are echoes, not voices. What remains of Akkad is language, the Akkadian tongue, which once carried orders across an empire and prayers up to the heavens. Every time a clay tablet bears those wedge-shaped marks, Akkad breathes again, quietly, invisibly. A city without a body, but not without a soul. It lives in the rhythm of syllables, in the careful hands of those who still translate its words. In this way, Akkad survives not as a ruin, but as a remembrance. 3. The poetry of absence. There is something profoundly peaceful in this disappearance. To leave no trace is to become part of everything, the soil, the river, the air. Perhaps the people of Akkad did not vanish suddenly. Perhaps they simply drifted away, carrying their customs, their songs, their speech into other towns, other kingdoms. Like ink spreading in water, their identity dissolved but did not end. The true city of Akkad may never be found because it never truly stayed in one place. It traveled in memory, in story, in the silent endurance of culture. Archaeologists can dig for walls, historians can reconstruct kings. But the real Akkad may live in something softer, the way humans remember what has been lost, shaping it into legend so it can never fade completely. 4. The city beneath the mind. Imagine walking at dusk along the Mesopotamian plain. The horizon burns gold, the air thick with dust and warmth. Somewhere beneath your feet, perhaps, lies the ghost of Akkad. Streets once trodden by soldiers, scribes, lovers, children. You cannot see them, yet the earth hums faintly, as if remembering. Every breath of wind carries a trace of voices long turned to silence. You begin to realize that the city's true survival is this, not in brick or bronze, but in the soft persistence of wonder. For what other vanished place still inspires such searching, such longing, after 4,000 years? The story of Akkad's disappearance is not tragedy, but transformation. It reminds us that memory is its own architecture, invisible yet enduring. Perhaps this is how empires truly achieve immortality. Not by what they leave behind, but by the longing they awaken in those who come after. Akkad may be gone, but every whisper of its name keeps it alive. The empire fell, the rivers changed course, but the idea of Akkad, the dream of a world united by language and faith, still stirs quietly in the heart of history. And maybe that is enough. Though the empire vanished, its language and legends endured, whispered in new tongues. Perhaps the truest strength lies in knowing when to let go. Empires often imagine themselves as eternal. They carve their names in stone, crown their kings as gods, and stretch their borders toward every horizon. But time has always spoken a gentler truth. Nothing endures unchanged. Akkad was the first to learn this on a scale so vast that it still echoes millennia later. Its rise was brilliant, swift, daring, defiant, and its fall, though quiet, was inevitable. Like the floodwaters that once nourished its fields, the empire's power receded, leaving behind fertile memory where new civilizations would one day grow. 1. Harvests failed. The gods fell silent. What had been abundance became austerity, and what was once unity turned again into a patchwork of city-states. Yet there was beauty even in this unraveling, a symmetry that mirrored the natural world. Leaves fall not in despair, but in rhythm. The tide withdraws so that it may return. Akkad, too, was part of that rhythm. The rise and retreat of human ambition, the endless cycle of creation and release. The empire did not end because it failed. It ended because it had fulfilled its purpose. It had shown the world that people could be more than scattered tribes, that the idea of empire, of shared language and law, could exist. And once that lesson took root, Akkad's body could fade, leaving only the idea to endure. 2. The quiet gift of decline. There is a strange peace in watching something greater than oneself pass into history. The Akkadians, scattered among the cities they once ruled, carried no bitterness in the clay they wrote upon. Their descendants continued to speak the Akkadian tongue, to praise the old gods, to trade and farm and dream beneath the same stars. Decline, then, was not death, it was transformation. Every ending teaches what permanence cannot: humility, reflection, and renewal. For the listeners who find calm in history's silence, this is the empire's final whisper, that even greatness must one day exhale, making space for what comes next. 3. Impermanence. As teacher, to study Akkad is to study time itself. The ruins that never were, the names carved in forgotten tablets, all speak to the same truth that the Sumerians once wrote. Nothing is as it was, and yet, there is comfort in that impermanence. For just as Akkad fell, so too did others rise. Babylon, Assyria, Persia, each carrying fragments of its memory forward. Each empire believed itself eternal, yet all, in their turn, returned to dust. It is not failure that binds them, but continuity, the shared heartbeat of human striving. To accept impermanence is not to surrender, but to understand. It is to see the full shape of history, not as loss but as movement. What begins must end. What ends must begin again. For the echo within us, perhaps that is why Akkad still lingers, not in monuments, but in the quiet spaces of thought. In every dream of unity, in every language that bridges nations, a faint reflection of Sargon's city glows. Empires crumble, ideals evolve, and in that endless exchange between birth and decay, humanity learns its gentlest lesson, that the beauty of existence lies not in how long it lasts, but in how deeply it is remembered. Akkad's lesson, then, is not of conquest or loss, but of grace in impermanence. It teaches that strength is not the power to endure forever, but the wisdom to let go when the world turns. As the dust settled over Mesopotamia, the land remained, fertile, enduring, waiting. From its soil would rise new cities, new voices, new dreams. And though Akkad itself was gone, its spirit, the belief in order, language, and divine purpose, would shape every civilization that followed. In silence, the empire had passed its torch. From ruins rise new foundations, and Akkad's spirit would shape all who followed. When memory becomes blueprint, the past builds anew. Empires rarely vanish completely. Their ideas, like seeds scattered by wind, find soil in unexpected places. So it was with Akkad. Long after its banners had fallen, its spirit endured, taking root once more in the cities of the south. Out of the silence that followed the Akkadian age, the Sumerians rose again, steady and deliberate. Their leader, Uarnamu, king of Uar, began not a rebellion but a restoration, a careful reweaving of the world that Sargon had once unified. Historians would call it the Uar III dynasty, the Neo-Sumerian revival, but in truth it was something deeper, a conversation with the past, spoken through law, worship, and clay. 1. A return to order. The ruins of Akkad were gone, but its lessons remained written on every heart of Mesopotamia. Uarnamu understood that empire was not merely conquest, it was administration, faith, and memory. His scribes copied old Akkadian tablets. His surveyors measured land with the same precision Sargon once demanded. The bureaucracy of Akkad became the skeleton of this new age, revived, refined, and sung in Sumerian once more. Across the land, canals were cleared, ziggurats rebuilt, archives reopened. Each act of restoration carried reverence, a belief that to rebuild was to remember. Cities like Uar, Uruk, and Nippur thrummed again with order and devotion. In temple hymns, the gods were praised not for conquest, but for renewal. It was as if Mesopotamia, weary from ambition, had turned inward, seeking peace in structure, not expansion. 2. Law, faith, and the measured world. Uarnamu's code of laws, one of humanity's oldest surviving legal systems, bore the imprint of Akkad's rational governance. Where Sargon once ruled through decree, Uarnamu wrote principles of justice, measured, calm, enduring. The clay tablets that preserved these laws became a quiet revolution, order written not by divine whim, but by human reason. In temples, priests sang ancient hymns in new voices. The goddess Inanna still received her offerings, as did Shamash, the sun god of truth and law. But the tone had shifted, from empire's grandeur to civilization's introspection. Where Naram-Sin sought to become divine, Uarnamu sought only harmony between the gods and men. Faith became rhythm again, not the roar of conquest, but the heartbeat of daily devotion. 3. The architecture of memory. The great ziggurat of Uar, rising step by step toward the heavens, stood as both monument and meditation. Its bricks were stamped with the king's name, but its meaning reached deeper, a link between earth and sky, between the living and the remembered. Each layer was a hymn to continuity, a declaration that though Akkad was gone, its essence, organization, reverence, endurance, still lived. Archaeologists later would find the craftsmanship astonishing. Baked bricks, drainage systems, inscriptions invoking both Sumerian and Akkadian deities. It was not merely architecture, it was a dialogue with the past, built from the dust of fallen empires. The people of Uar walked among these monuments not with triumph, but with calm pride. They had survived chaos. They had outlasted gods who demanded too much. And now, in the quiet evening light, they rebuilt the world, one stone, one song, one law at a time. For the gentle echo of empire, the Neo-Sumerian kings never called themselves conquerors. Instead, they called themselves shepherds, caretakers of civilization. It was a title born of humility and perhaps of wisdom learned from Akkad's rise and fall. The Akkadian dream had not vanished. It had matured. From empire to stewardship, from dominance to devotion, Mesopotamia had learned to temper its power with reflection. And so, through the dynasty of Ur, the world's first empire found its second life, not in war, but in memory transformed into structure. Yet beyond Sumer, another power would soon inherit Akkad's crown. Every empire is a story rewritten in another's hand. When the dust of the Neo-Sumerian world began to settle, a new voice rose from the plains, steady, confident, and familiar. That voice spoke in Akkadian, the old tongue reborn, but now it belonged to Babylon. In this new city, surrounded by river-fed gardens and sacred precincts, the story of empire began again, gentler, wiser, and more enduring. 1. The language that endured centuries after Akkad's fall. The Akkadian language had not perished. It lingered in scribal schools, in temple hymns, in the clay tablets buried beneath time. When Babylon began its ascent under the kings of the first dynasty, it chose Akkadian as its written heart. Sumerian remained a language of ritual, but Akkadian, shaped, simplified, and refined, became the medium of thought, trade, and diplomacy. Through it, the wisdom of Sargon's empire whispered into a new age. Babylon's scribes did not invent a civilization from nothing. They inherited one line by line, glyph by glyph, tablet by tablet. Every contract signed, every law inscribed, carried echoes of the North's lost capital. It was as though Akkad's memory had turned into grammar, a living monument of words. 2. Hammurabi and the order of the world. Then came Hammurabi, the sixth king of Babylon, not a conqueror in the style of Sargon, but a legislator of remarkable depth. He united the cities of Mesopotamia not by sword alone, but through law, and in doing so, he revived the spirit of administration that had once defined Akkad. The Code of Hammurabi, carved upon basalt and set before the image of Shamash, god of justice, was more than a decree. It was a mirror of civilization. It proclaimed fairness in trade, responsibility in duty, and consequence in harm. Where Sargon had ruled by command, Hammurabi ruled by principle. To the modern reader, these words may feel distant, but in their time they represented a profound act of trust, that human order could reflect cosmic order, that justice could outlast kings. And in the stillness of the temples, where scribes copied these laws by lamplight, the pulse of Akkad could almost be heard again. 3. Faith in familiar forms. Hammurabi's Babylon did not invent its gods. It inherited them. Ishtar, Enlil, Shamash, all ancient names carried forward, reshaped but not replaced. Even the mighty Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, was woven into this lineage, his myths composed in the style of older Akkadian hymns. In these stories, the gods were not distant forces but reflections of human destiny, of rise and fall, justice and pride. The temples that lined Babylon's avenues were filled with the incense and chant of 1,000 years of faith, each ritual echoing a rhythm first struck in Sumer and Akkad. Religion here was less about dominance, more about continuity, the binding of generations by shared reverence. The divine kingship of Naram-Sin had long passed, but its memory lingered, tempered by the wisdom of restraint. Hammurabi ruled not as God, but as the chosen servant of divine law, a humbler reflection of the same eternal pattern. For legacy of a living memory, Babylon became what Akkad could not, enduring. Its scholars catalogued the skies, its priests recorded eclipses and omens, its builders raised ziggurats that glowed like fire at dusk. Each act was both new and remembered, innovation born from inheritance. And though the capital of Akkad was lost, its language, laws, and ideals lived on in every Babylonian tablet. The Akkadian Empire, long gone from stone, had survived in thought, translated, adapted, reborn. In the quiet corridors of Babylon's palaces, history itself seemed to hum, a melody that had begun with Sargon, deepened through Naram-Sin, and now softened into harmony under Hammurabi's rule. For the people of Babylon, to remember was to exist. And in their remembrance, the world's first empire lived again, not as ruin, but as heritage. And in the north, the Assyrians carried the flame higher still. Names carved in stone still speak, even when the stones have crumbled. North of Babylon, where the Tigris narrowed and the hills began to rise, a new kingdom took breath. Its kings, proud, disciplined, enduring, called themselves Assyrians, and in their palaces, the old names still lived. Sargon, Naram-Sin, Akkad. They were not forgotten myths, but ancestral ideals, invoked in prayers, echoed in royal titles, remembered in the cadence of language. Assyria was not a rebirth of the Akkadian Empire, it was its continuum. Its scribes still wrote in Akkadian script, though the speech had changed with time. Its rulers still looked to the southern plains for legitimacy, as children look to elders. And in the heart of their empire, from Ashur to Nineveh, the dream that Sargon once shaped in clay and conquest was quietly rekindled. 1. The lineage of kings Assyrian monarchs claimed descent not just from gods, but from Sargon of Akkad himself. In their inscriptions, they spoke of restoring his boundaries, of renewing the order he had once brought to the world. The title King of the Four Quarters, first born by Naram-Sin, reappeared like a sacred refrain, a mantra linking them to a golden age. Centuries had passed, yet the image of the god-king still guided their sense of purpose. For the Assyrians, empire was not a novelty. It was a duty, the continuation of something divine begun long before. Even their art, with its flowing reliefs of battles and triumphs, carried the same serene precision found in Akkadian carvings. Not chaos, but controlled power, disciplined beauty. 2. The language of legacy, the Akkadian language, refined through centuries, had become the lingua franca of the Near East. From Anatolia to the Levant, treaties and royal correspondence were written in its familiar wedge-shaped script. Though Assyrians spoke their own dialect, it was still called Akkadian, as though naming it preserved its soul. In the libraries of Nineveh, tablets copied and recopied the old myths, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Curse of Akkad, the hymns of Ishtar. Each inscription was an act of remembrance, a whisper across time. To the Assyrians, writing was not merely record, it was resurrection. Through it, they conversed with the past, keeping the empire of memory alive even as the world changed around them. Among these tablets, the name of Sargon still shone. He was no longer just a king. He had become a symbol of permanence, proof that empire could survive death through language. 3. Ideology of continuity. Assyria's power reached far beyond Akkad's old borders, yet its heart beat to the same rhythm: order, divinity, destiny. The Assyrian kings saw themselves as guardians of civilization, chosen by the gods to impose harmony upon the earth's disorder. Where Sargon had sought unity, they sought endurance. In every campaign and every inscription, the tone was calm, deliberate, not boasting but affirming the natural order of kingship. Even in their vastness, there was the same quiet resolve that had once filled the courts of Agade. The belief that empire, like the stars above Mesopotamia, was meant to last. Yet time, always patient, moved on. The language of Akkad would one day fade, the palaces of Assyria would fall, and the tablets would sleep beneath the sand. But their words, once spoken, would never fully vanish. They became the unseen thread tying all who came after, Babylonians, Persians, scholars, dreamers, to that first empire's eternal idea. And so, as the echoes fade, we return to where it began, the dream of unity beneath Mesopotamia's stars. When archaeologists lift a shard of clay, they hold the breath of an ancient dream. Beneath the dust of ages, time sleeps in silence. Yet sometimes, a human hand disturbs that silence, brushing aside grains of earth to reveal the faint impression of a wedge, the whisper of a line once pressed into wet clay by another hand, 4,000 years ago. The rediscovery of the Akkadian world did not begin with monuments or treasures, but with fragments, tiny tablets, broken and scattered, the remnants of memory itself. 1. The language awakened for millennia. The world forgot how to read the voices of Akkad. The cuneiform script, once used from the Persian Gulf to the Levant, became a riddle lost to time. When scholars of the 19th century first uncovered tablets from Mesopotamia's ruins, in Nineveh, Ur, and Sippar, they did not yet realize they were hearing the return of Akkadian speech. Each tablet was a quiet miracle. Messages of kings, hymns to Ishtar, receipts for grain, letters of longing, all inscribed in the same timeless script. Through the patience of men like Henry Rawlinson, who studied the Behistun inscription carved high on a Persian cliff, the wedge shapes began to speak again. Slowly, syllable by syllable, the lost world of Sargon and Naram-Sin stirred awake. It was not conquest or empire that had endured, it was language, the oldest form of permanence. And when that language returned, so did the calm dignity of the people who spoke it. 2. The archaeology of memory in the quiet halls of museums. Akkad lives again, not as empire, but as echo. Tablets line glass cases, their surfaces soft with the marks of ancient styluses. The smell of baked clay carries the faint scent of river silt, as if the Tigris itself had hidden these words for safekeeping. Each discovery tells a story. A merchant's account of silver traded for lapis, a royal decree sealed with a god's emblem, a hymn composed by a temple poet. These are not relics of glory, they are fragments of daily life, of humanity learning to speak to itself across time. Archaeologists, brushing soil from a tablet, become something more than scientists. They are listeners, bending close to catch the murmur of a vanished world. And in that stillness, the old voices return. Sargon's command, Naram-Sin's prayer, a scribe's note to his son. The Akkadians did not know we would hear them again. Yet their words have endured longer than the empires that followed. 3. The wonder of rediscovery. There is a particular peace in rediscovering what was once lost. Unlike conquest, discovery demands no surrender. It is a meeting between past and present, quiet, equal, and full of awe. When a tablet emerges from the earth after 4 millennia, its script is not ancient. It is alive. It speaks in the same rhythm as a heartbeat, steady, deliberate, full of intent. Each inscription, once deciphered, restores a piece of humanity's long conversation with itself. How we learn to build, to govern, to pray, to dream. Scholars now read the hymns of Akkad in translation, their cadence slow and lyrical. O Ishtar, Queen of Heaven, whose voice is sweet, your glory fills the lands. And though the language is old, its tone is familiar, reverent, yearning, human. To listen is to remember that every civilization begins as a voice in the dark, speaking toward tomorrow. For the living echo today, the Akkadian tongue survives in dictionaries, databases, and classrooms. Students trace its signs on paper or screens, repeating the same shapes once carved into clay by ancient scribes. In this act, this calm, careful imitation, the chain of memory remains unbroken. To study Akkad is to witness the quiet endurance of civilization. No empire can last forever, but the act of remembrance can. The Akkadians, who once united their world through order and faith, have now united ours through knowledge. Their voices, lifted from silence, remind us that history is not gone. It only waits to be read. And so, when an archaeologist lifts a shard of clay, they are not merely holding earth. They are holding time, the breath of a dream once spoken by the first empire. But beyond memory, the truest legacy lies in what humanity learned. Empires fade, but the desire to build, to remember, and to dream endures. Night falls again over the Mesopotamian plain. The rivers shimmer under a quiet sky, and the wind moves softly through the ruins where once kings walked. In the hush, you might almost hear it, the heartbeat of a vanished world, steady as the stars above. The story of Akkad is not only one of conquest and collapse. It is a mirror held up to humanity itself, showing us what it means to build, to believe, to endure, and to begin again. For in the rhythm of empires, we find the rhythm of the human spirit, creation, flourishing, and inevitable change. 1. The desire to unite. When Sargon first rose from the dust of Kish, he carried more than ambition. He carried a vision that many cities could become one, that language and law could bind hearts as tightly as armies. It was the first time humanity dreamed of unity beyond tribe, of governance that stretched from mountain to sea. The Akkadians were not the last to chase that dream. Each civilization that followed, Babylonian, Persian, Roman, and modern, has echoed the same longing. To bring order to chaos, to find meaning in collective effort, to give form to the invisible bond that makes us human. But unity, like clay, must be tended. Left to dry, it cracks. Too much pressure, and it shatters. Akkad teaches that power alone cannot hold a people together. Only shared belief, compassion, and remembrance can. 2. The fragility of greatness empires, for all their might, are delicate things. A change in the river's course, a failure of rain, a forgotten prayer, and centuries of labor can crumble overnight. The Akkadian collapse was not just the fall of a kingdom. It was a reminder that no creation, however grand, escapes the turning of time. And yet, there is beauty in that fragility. To know that every monument will erode, every name will fade, and still to build, that is humanity's quiet courage. The Akkadians built not because they believed they would last forever, but because they believed it mattered now. We too live within that same moment. Building, writing, remembering, knowing the wind will one day take it all, but hoping that somewhere, someone will find the pieces and understand. 3. The enduring language of faith. When the Akkadians spoke of their gods, they were not only describing the divine, they were describing themselves. Faith was the shape they gave to mystery, the pattern they saw in the movement of stars and floods. It taught them humility, that even kings were but stewards of time, and that power without reverence leads only to silence. In their temples, under torchlight, priests and poets sang to gods whose names have nearly vanished. Enlil, Inanna, Shamash. Their songs were not for conquest, but for connection, a reaching outward to something vast and unseen. Every time we look up at the night sky in wonder, we repeat their prayer. 4. Lessons in continuity. The Akkadians may have vanished as a people, but not as an idea. Their methods of rule shaped Babylon's laws. Their myths inspired Gilgamesh. Their words became the foundation of Assyrian speech. Even now, in the soft glow of a museum light or the turning page of a history book, they live. To study Akkad is to remember that civilization is not a single story but a chorus, each empire, each generation, adding its voice to a song that never truly ends. The Akkadians sang the first verse of unity, of ambition balanced with awe. We, their distant heirs, continue the melody. 5. Under the same stars somewhere above the ruins of Akkad, the same stars still shine, patient, unchanging, older than every empire that has come and gone. If you were to stand there now, in the cool quiet of evening, you might feel the same wonder that Sargon felt when he looked up from his city's walls. Empires fade. Languages fall silent. But the desire to build, to remember, to dream endures. That is the human legacy of Akkad. Not the walls or the wars, but the will to create meaning from the dust, and to keep dreaming long after the dreamers are gone. And so, the story of Akkad closes, not as an ending, but as the quiet continuation of humanity's timeless dream. Under the same stars somewhere above the ruins of Akkad, the same stars still shine, patient, unchanging, older than every empire that has come and gone. If you were to stand there now, in the cool quiet of evening, you might feel the same wonder that Sargon felt when he looked up from his city's walls. Empires fade. Languages fall silent. But the desire to build, to remember, to dream endures. That is the human legacy of Akkad. Not the walls or the wars, but the will to create meaning from the dust, and to keep dreaming long after the dreamers are gone. And so, the story of Akkad closes, not as an ending, but as the quiet continuation of humanity's timeless dream. And so, the story of Akkad closes, not as an ending, but as the quiet continuation of humanity's timeless dream.